Welcome to iPad Pros, the show all about using your iPad to be productive and get work done. I'm Tim Chaten, host of the show.
Kind of freaked out. It was the reason I knew that this was going to be a great release was when I saw that the same custom keyboard shortcut manager from the Mac version was in the iPad version. You know, it's the same thing you would expect, like if you're running Pro Tools or Logic or any one of these programs that has such an advanced feature set that they allow you to take any small little task, you know, that you might do and then add a key command to it.
Welcome to another episode of iPad Pros. This is a moment in the iPad's history I've been dreaming about since we first got the iPad back in 2010. The day is finally here. Some 11 years later, we now have true professional desktop class music notation software on the iPad. Through not just one app, but two. This, as you can see by the runtime of the episode, will be the longest and most in-depth episode of the podcast to date. Robby Burns, who is a music educator that uses these tools for his work, joins me to discuss the arrival of Sibelius and Dorico for iPad. These are two of the biggest music notation applications out there, and they have finally ported them to the iPad. And not as little companion apps, but instead bringing the full power of the desktop app experience to the iPad. This is comparable to if Apple brought Final Cut Pro to the iPad and did so in a way that it was the actual full-fledged application. For those that don't know my background, in college I studied music composition and have spent I don't know how many thousands of hours writing music in Finale. Well, finally, that same experience I cut my teeth on in high school and college is here on the iPad. And it really is a groundbreaking moment for this vertical of professionals that include composers, arrangers, music engravers, music educators, and others that use this kind of software for their work. As we'll talk about in this episode, Apple's move to the M1 chip on the Mac encouraged the Dorico team to take that leap to make this a reality on the iPad. This shared chip architecture is already benefiting the iPad, and I hope this is just the beginning, and other professional markets will make the same realization and port their desktop class apps to the iPad. With that said, I just want to remind everyone that you can now financially support iPad Pros in two different places. First off, patreon.com/iPadPros. Get episodes early and with embedded MP3 chapter markers by supporting the podcast at any tier. Bonus content is also available at the higher tiers. You can also now subscribe to iPad Pros in Apple Podcasts. Apple Podcasts is an all-inclusive single subscription, so you'll get all of the bonus content plus episodes early by subscribing to the show in Apple Podcasts. By default, subscriptions are monthly, but if you go into your subscription settings in the Settings app, you can switch it to a yearly plan. My thanks to everyone that currently or has in the past supported the podcast financially. This podcast is not a quick one to produce, especially this episode, and your support is greatly, greatly appreciated. You can also support the podcast for free simply by leaving a review in Apple Podcasts. No matter your region, it really does help. The reviews help send the right signals to Apple to show this podcast more in search, helping others discover the show. If you have a minute today, I'd really appreciate you opening up the podcast app and leaving a review. My thanks to everyone that has already done that. With that, here's my discussion with Robby, all about the arrival of Dorico and Sibelius for iPad. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Robby.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm super excited for this conversation. Before we get to what this conversation is, can you just kind of introduce yourself and how you use the iPad?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Robby Burns. I'm a musician and percussionist and educator in Maryland. I teach middle school band and general music in the Howard County Public School System, which is one of the many counties in Maryland. And, you know, some school systems would call these like districts. We organize by counties. And there in Howard County, I am pretty involved, both with extracurricular county music opportunities, like I co-direct the middle school honor band here. And then outside of the school day, I have a big private teaching studio where I teach percussion. Percussion is the instrument that I've studied the most of my life, and it is something that I stay really active and engaged doing through gigging and freelancing, but lately in my life more often through private teaching. I've got about 20 private students who take lessons with me in my studio, most of whom are also members of the same school district that I teach in, because this is also just happens to be the area that I live. So in addition to that, I am an author, blogger, and podcaster, and make resources for music teachers and do a whole lot of stuff involving using technology to be more productive and creative in the music classroom.
Excellent. And do you follow your kids past middle school, like into high school teaching as well?
Yeah, I follow my middle school students from the time that they start with me until they graduate high school. And what that looks like for some of them is that they study with me even before their school might offer an instrument as a class. So I've had students as early as, the second and the first grade, in which case we're doing very, very different things than I might do with a fourth or a fifth grader. And then, I follow them as long as they continue to take lessons with me, up until they turn 18 and graduate high school, at which case many of them will go on to do things musical, but many of them will also not go on to do things musical. And, what that process looks like is different for every kid. But I certainly have a really large and diverse studio here, and I follow them. I mean, part of what I take pride in is just being able to, like, in a way that you can't in a middle school classroom, you can't really take a performing musician and have control over how they're learning something from the very, very first stages. So
right.
to be able to develop that with someone and then follow it all the way through to the point where you can actually see them off to starting their own career in music built on those foundations that you started them with is a real rewarding process.
Yeah, I vividly remember my middle school band teacher and the private teachers I had back then, and yeah, it's a very influential part in your life, and it's must be really rewarding in that way. And with percussion, that's always been. I'm a wind guy. I play mostly woodwinds, a little bit of brass.
Yeah,
and percussion, it's like a whole section versus I play the woodwinds versus I play saxophone. It's that like a studio of that. You must have a basin just filled with mallets and snare drums and what's that look like?
Yeah, so I'm actually down here now. So I've got my whole computer technology desk set up with lots of gear, MIDI controllers, microphone, and an interface, and all sorts of other things. And then as I sort of turn around me to my left, I have a resource library of method books and scores and all sorts of musical resources. And then to the left of that is all of my wind instruments, like my horn, trumpet, trombone, saxophone, clarinet, flutes, concert snare drum, crash cymbals, a vibraphone, a 5-octave marimba, 4 timpani, some bongos and congas, glockenspiel, a second marimba, and then a grand piano, well, not a grand piano, but a full-size MIDI piano, and then some stringed instruments hanging on the wall here as well.
That's awesome.
Guitars and mandolins and things and basses. So yeah, it's full. It's just full of instruments, and it's a real good time.
Yeah, I love the marimba, and as a kid and even into college, vibraphone was a guilty pleasure instrument of mine.
You should. So my marimba, you can cut this out if you want, if it's not relevant to your listeners. But so, are you familiar with Janice Potter?
I'm not. No.
So she is just an internationally recognized and respected performer and educator. And when she switched, so she was using an Adams instrument, which is like a company that's part of Pearl, who makes drum sets, and Adams is their classical division. And for a long time, she was touring with an Adams instrument, and part of her deal with them was, I think, that she would, they would always they would have certain things that they would provide for her, and then she would always play on one of their instruments when she would tour and do master classes and all this kind of stuff. And something happened in that relationship. She decided to work with an up and coming company that was designing their marimba. She was trying to help them make it sound better, and for whatever reason, she needed to sell her most recent Adams marimba, and so I was at the time looking, and she was living in the same area that I was, and so I have Janice Potter's 5-octave marimba, and she actually, the cool thing is that she handpicked every single bar from the Adams factory to make sure that they all just perfectly speak and resonate. And then actually I have two. It's great. Yeah, I have two, actually a touring set too. I have a set in boxes where she also handpicked.
That's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. So today's episode, we're going to focus mainly on the very exciting news and releases of Dorico and Sibelius for iPad. Both of these being very pro-level apps, and they're now on iPad, and it kind of is opening a brand new, vertical of professionals that can now work on iPad that couldn't yesterday. Or they could, but it'd be with some other tools that may not be as feature-rich or provide the experience we're quite looking for. And we'll get into what some of those apps are that are still really good as well. But before we do that, how do you use the iPad, both as a music educator and kind of in your day-to-day life?
Yeah, good question. As I was thinking through this, I think that this like how I use the iPad could potentially be a theme throughout this conversation, because I think that the two apps that we're gonna, I think, dominantly talk about sort of like outline this theme. There's kind of like different ways that I use the iPad, and I sort of can divide it into two, generally speaking, two categories. And one of them is like the iPad as this like modular piece of hardware that can like sort of, you can like take it off of the keyboard stand, you can use it with a pencil, you can use it in your hand, you can read it like a book, you can put it on the keyboard and then use it more like a laptop. And so this sort of like in this modular sense of being able to attach it to a keyboard and having it run super similar software to what I'm using on my Mac, which is, you know, a lot of first and third party productivity pieces of software, other kinds of creative and professional musical tools, like things that when you have a similar enough experience on the mobile version and the desktop version, the iPad almost just becomes like a different window into the same data that I'm interacting with on the Mac. So in that sense, very, very Mac-like, but leveraging some of the things that make the iPad. And then there's this other sort of part of the coin, which I think has gotten a lot of attention lately, which is like this idea of what kinds of apps really make the iPad an iPad. And that's obviously arguable because, like I was just saying, you know, like I can use it in many cases to be a productivity machine, much like I use my desktop computer. But the iPad does, when you detach it from the keyboard and handle it directly with your hand or with an Apple Pencil, it can become kind of like this piece of paper. And I would say that in the classroom, in my in that part of my life responsibilities, there's unfortunately not as much software I'm interacting with on a day-to-day basis that I can control. Like when I'm, editing like my blog and my podcast, or like when I'm like typing an email, like I can control what email app I use, what note-taking app I use, what kinds of like workflows and, automations are going to really, really help me to excel. But like at school, I have like a lot of web-based software that I'm depending on.
Right.
So there's not always quite as much control for me there. So the iPad often tends to fit a little bit more into the place of like the digital piece of paper. So I'm doing things on it like running sheet music in the app Musescore, annotating sheet music, putting notes for class or, on a note and then like annotating them. What I like to do is actually take a seating chart with all my band students on it and then take informal notes on them during class. So usually in class, I'll have like the Musescore with my music on one half of the iPad screen and then good notes on the other half of the screen with a seating chart or maybe some, I'll use it as a digital whiteboard sometimes and like project a blank white good notes note to the projector behind me. So there's, those are the kinds of things. It's kind of like, I think it's getting, I'm pushing it, to the platform's highest level of potential when it's in that, like in front of me on a music stand.
Yeah.
In rehearsal.
Gotcha. Yeah. And something I discovered when setting up my podcasting focus with iPad OS 15 is how really kind of cool the web app kind of experience is on iPad. Like I was saving to the home screen the WordPress page for iPad Pros to do the posting of the site. When I did that, it's like, oh, it's a separate app when I launch it now. It's like separated from Safari and the app switcher. So I'm not sure if that's something you played around with some of those school apps of having these different, like kind of in the app launcher, at least these kind of separate little web apps for school.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I track podcast analytics for my own show using Libsyn, and I have made a little Libsyn app on my iPhone in that same way you just described.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've noticed a lot of those same behaviors make it feel more like an app and less like a website. And yeah, so I have not yet considered, it's always this juggling match with like how well is, I don't want to throw the iPad under the bus here, but it's like sometimes the iPad Safari doesn't always handle some of these education websites as well as the desktop, but it's not even it's sometimes like there isn't a web browser in the whole world that'll handle these websites. They're just kind of bad web apps. Yep. So mileage may vary. So I, like for example, Canvas, which is our learning management software, like they have an iPad app that affords lots of, like they designed it with a lot of the same things that you're used to if you've used like the iWork suite. So it's got like really similar UI elements, like back buttons in most places. The list views all use like the same font and scroll really smoothly, and things are very responsive. But it's missing the most important thing that I do in Canvas, which is look at the grades, kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, like in a grid view, like with columns and rows. And like there's no way to input a grade into the iPad version of the app this way.
It's funny with some web apps, it's like a balance of, should I use the website or the native app? And sometimes you'll switch back and forth between them. Google's a great example of this. Sometimes, the native app's better for this one thing, and then it's a thing.
That's the perfect example, because when I'm on that is actually something that we use a lot of in my work environment. And when I'm on my desktop, I wouldn't imagine using them as apps, even if they were available to me, because they sort of feel, native to the web.
Right.
And web browsers are really kind of like point and clicky and precise and accurate with all their buttons and knobs and whistles and things on a desktop. Whereas on iOS, it's like I've got desktop class Safari now, so I can interact with it, and I want to interact with it in that way. But then the apps are just like polished a little nicer and
and we have a trackpad now, so even the web browser has some and even the app can take advantage of that, but sometimes they don't really do that yet if it's on a great app. So it's a complicated thing. So I graduated college in 2010, so I had the iPad for all of like 3 or 4 months before I was out of school, and it was a new and exciting thing, and it's now been like a decade. What's the iPad like in the music scene these days? Is it being used on music stands as sheet music? Is that widespread now, or what's the kind of the situation?
Yeah, when I saw that you wanted to ask this question, I feel like there's a couple different angles I could answer it. I mean, if you want to talk about, I guess I'll address teachers first. Like, teachers have some amount of autonomy over what kinds of tools they're using in their life to get their work done. So it is very, very common these days to see any kind of like musical performer or teacher working with an iPad as at the least some kind of device for reading and annotating sheet music. I've really, in the past 5 years, seen it take off. A lot of my colleagues who thought 8-9 years ago, I was like this crazy person with an iPad Air and Musescore at the concert reading off of, and everyone was like, what is happening? And now I'm seeing more of that go on. And, whether or not teachers take it farther than that, like to the extent that we're talking about with, using it more like to get professional work done, like a laptop or with automation or any of these kinds of things, it's kind of varied teacher per teacher, but most teachers are very, very comfortable with some of those kinds of basics. So I do see it a lot more lately. For me, I'm always trying to do more with mine, but in the classroom, we have that kind of like web-based software thing we were talking about before, but it's also kind of tied into like what the students are doing. Like, because all of our software is web-based, it's more equitable and cross-platform, so it's basically more accessible to a wider variety of the students that we serve in our district. But this, of course, means that the best and most affordable device to get them a window into all that stuff that's going on is a Chromebook. So I see that students, at least in the public school system, are using iPads less than I had maybe thought 10 years ago we would see. Mm-hmm. The Chromebook has really sort of taken the place because of the reasons I just stated, like having this.
Cheap.
Cost is one thing. It's cheap, right? But also, I think like the equity of web-based software and just how, I thought that web-based software was eventually going to die, and that has like been like the most dead wrong assumption I had 10 years ago about where apps were going.
Yeah, we'll have to chat about Sibelius and the web. I'm so curious if you know anything about that. We'll have to, when we get to Sibelius, I'm curious how the feature parity is between the different platforms, because it surprised me that they advertise, you can use Sibelius on the web to write music. It's like, okay.
I think that'll tie in a little bit to one of your next questions coming up too. But I mean, it's interesting. Like, my students don't get to kind of use, this has been sort of a thing for me, is like the iPad is like definitely a device that I use for teacher-facing experiences and software that sometimes make my students' lives better. But for the most part, our digital interaction is happening through web stuff. And this is just maybe a sort of a meta point. I don't know if this fits quite into your question or not, but I think it's just interesting to see, especially with the last year, how much bargaining on, how much payoff there has been through sort of having all of these educational offerings through the web. when we needed to basically have them in order to be able to communicate with each other.
Right.
And then having these low-priced Chromebooks so that we could get them into every kid's hands. It's just been super, it was like super useful for us this past year. But then on the other end of the coin, I'm wondering like, what if Apple's vision had one day had sort of taken off in an alternate universe? Because Apple's approach is they do have a learning management, kind of piece to their puzzle. It's like they've got Apple Classroom, and you can deploy them. I don't know actually if have you ever had anyone on the show who does deployment of iPads in the classroom?
Yeah, we have talked a little bit about that in the past.
Yeah, Apple's just taken a very in the same way that a lot of things that are happening on the web with other services are things that happen on device. For Apple, they've taken a very sort of app-centric approach to education, where it's like, okay, well, we want you to write a native app, and then we'll give you the tools to make an API where you can integrate those apps into Apple Classroom. And that's just very much not proven to be the most pervasive thing in education, as much as open web standards have been.
Yeah, and I'll be curious if Apple ever makes better use of open web standards to make it as another option for the iPad if you did get that alternative.
Sure.
Because they don't support web apps amazingly well. They could do a lot more with that, as others have pointed out in various lawsuits against Apple.
Right.
So what is your actual iPad setup?
Okay. I am working with a 12.9-inch iPad Pro from 2018.
Mm-hmm.
I'm using the Magic Keyboard and the Apple Pencil, and do you want to know software too in that question, or?
Yeah, anything general else about the iPad? We should probably touch on it now before we move on to the meat of the show of music notation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to categorize my setup on the iPad is that it is generally kind of set up with the Magic Keyboard, but I kind of carry it around that way, but then I rip it off fairly frequently when I'm on the couch, or if I'm moving around a lot more. And we'll use the Apple Pencil. We could certainly talk for 2 hours about just task management alone if we wanted to. So
that should probably be a different show. Yep, different episode.
Probably should be a different one. Yeah, I mean, I think that just to speak to the iPad before we get into the notation stuff, I thought that before WWDC this past year, maybe that the iPad was going to go in a different direction. And it seems like what Apple wants to do with the iPad is really continue to double down on iPad OS as sort of flexing unique strengths.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that far off into the future, there will be ways in which Mac OS and iPad OS continue to, where there's more of a story to be told about. Because I think it's like the elephant in the room constantly, right? Like I was saying earlier, when my iPad is plugged into the Magic Keyboard, it's frustrating that it doesn't really do some things that a piece like a Mac could do, or run certain apps that a Mac could run, like Ableton Live or Logic Pro. So I'm curious to see where that story goes. I don't think the story is over, but some people were saying will Mac OS apps run on the iPad now that it's got the M1 chip, and that you can plug it into a Thunder, use a Thunderbolt port and things, and get a nice big display plugged into it. I don't know that I think that that's the direction the iPad is going. So while maybe a couple of months ago I was expecting a little bit more to just try to go all in on the iPad as my one singular device, I would say that this next school year, I'm very much looking forward to kind of combining some of these new web experiences that have entered in the classroom through COVID with just kind of really flexing my iPad as this really fantastic touch device that can be whatever I need it to be in any context.
Yeah, I mean, the Mac has so much legacy code. These apps, as we'll talk about Finale as just a mention, because it's one of the older ones, it's 30 plus years old or something, 32 years old. I don't know. I gotta look up. It's in, well, when we hit it, it's in the notes of, I looked up how old, and there's so much legacy code that I don't think every Mac app could run on the iPad without those Mac apps being modernized in huge ways. So I think that's part of the issue of people expecting, every Mac app should run on it. Yeah, I do think one day we'll have big Thunderbolt displays you can hook up to it, and it'll be a better multi-display setup, but I think it'll be just a slow evolution of iPad apps being more and more powerful with better and better APIs, and it'll be a gradual improvement versus a big leap in running Mac apps which aren't optimized for touch at all on the iPad.
That's kind of the impression that I took away also from the developer conference this past spring. And that it's going to be a long road, but it is going to be a slowly iterative one, not like tomorrow a touchscreen Mac or like an iPad that runs Mac OS is going to drop all of a sudden.
Yeah. And iPad OS 15 lays a really great groundwork of making the iPad even more an iPad, with multitasking being all touch enabled and friendly. And then maybe we can, now that we have this good foundation, start to add external monitor support and make it more of the things power users hopefully want as well. So let's now dive into music notation. And this is a scene I've been following since the iPad first came out. I had the people that created Notion, one of the earliest and best music notation apps for iPad, and still is a really great app, on the show. And I've been blown away what they did back in the day, and their app continues to get better and better. And music notation is something that I've used since probably 2006 in high school when I first got into writing music. No, before that, 2002. I'd say. That was probably when I first got into it, kind of freshman year of high school. I haven't used music notation software day and day as I had back up until 2010, but I did use it pretty much daily, with Finale being the tool of choice. And this is an industry and a scene I really care about because it's something that brought me so much joy and is now again bringing me so much joy. So I'm very excited about these apps coming to the iPad. And let's just lay the groundwork here of what does it look like today on the Mac? Because when I left college, Dorico wasn't even a twinkle in anyone's eye quite yet. So what's happened here?
Right. So Finale definitely is the one that's been around the longest. And, I think in the kinds of circles of people who use this kind of software, and for me, I'm surrounded by music teachers, and we are a little bit of we have different needs and expectations and interests than maybe like someone who's doing professional composing or engraving. So this software definitely serves me a little bit differently. And so some of my answers might be a little bit colored by that perspective. But yeah, Finale definitely is the one that's been around the longest. And I know that.
Yeah, I looked up here. Finale's 32 years old. Sibelius is 28 years old. So that's kind of Finale is... I'm barely older than Finale.
Right. Yeah. No, and I definitely did not grow up using Finale. By the time that I started to get into this was late high school, early college, and Sibelius was a pretty established competitor by that time. And, the way that it does work in these professional composing and teaching communities is a lot of times you either, because you're a professional and you depend on very deep feature sets, it's really hard to kind of pull you from what you're comfortable workflows are once something new and hot comes along. So in education, it's the same but a little different. I mean, it's not the same. It's not a different idea. It's just that I think that teachers are already a little bit reluctant to learn technology. So it's like, if you know Finale and then like something like Sibelius comes along, like why would you even have a spare second in your day, of grading and answering to doing parent conferences, like to learn some new thing. So I mean, it's this people. Apps like Finale tend to have this staying power because, it's just such a long-lasting industry standard. I still have lots of colleagues who use it. Sibelius was very comparable by the time I started using this software, which was also in the early 2000s. Sibelius was just sort of like what the talk of the university was, and it was recommended by numerous professors and students. I bought it with the educator discount. I don't remember how I afforded it. And I mean, looking at the prices of this desktop software, I don't remember how I afforded this software back in college. But I remember getting Sibelius like 4 or 5 or 6 or one of those versions that was out at the time. And that was kind of like my roots for composing music on a desktop computer. And I got pretty good at Sibelius to the point where I comfortably presented at some music conferences on the subject of getting more efficient in Sibelius. And it was for a long time. It was a really good and useful app for me. And then around the time that they were bought by Avid, things started to, like, there were certain things that they were and weren't doing with the software that, in light of all the other exciting things that were happening in technology, it just seemed like it was getting a little bit stagnant in terms of like the design of the program, and the features were not getting huge updates. And Avid introduced some complexities into the licensing process. You had to like run this Avid installer constantly on your computer, and then I know that for me, being a design-minded person, a little bit snobby about that. A lot of my colleagues, of course, are not. So they're just like fine and happy using Sibelius. And then the subscription pricing model kicks in, and that is something that a lot of people aren't crazy about. So I think that between these movements and then now like a bunch of other options that have entered the scene since then, I think there's not necessarily like one standard way people make music. I mean, it used to be for a while Sibelius and Finale, but then of course when Avid bought Sibelius, they let go part of that team, and that team became the team that for years and years and years developed Dorico. And that is my primary Mac notation editor ever since it released, which is about 4 or 5 years ago. And they have been really, really transparent about the update process. They're very, very generous with their time and with their wisdom on their user forums. And they've just done a lot to really quickly iterate on the first version of the app. And they've rethought a lot of things that, I mean, like Finale being an example of something that has like largely stayed the same and maybe could be critiqued for not innovating enough. Dorico is sort of like they came to it with like, okay, what are all the things we've learned about making Sibelius, and how do we, like, if we had to start fresh, which we have this opportunity to do, what are the things we would just totally get rid of, and how would we like rethink this kind of software? So that's kind of where Dorico enters the scene, and it's been my primary desktop editor since. But there's lots of other interesting things going on in this space, like Musescore is an open source and free program, which if I were a student when that, like if I were a student today, I mean, free is a good price. So
right.
I would probably be using it. And, they were purchased by Ultimate Guitar, who has a Guitar Tab website. But then that whole company recently rebranded as the Muse Group. And now they bought Audacity, a very, very popular open source desktop audio editor. And then they bought StaffPad, which I know you've addressed that app on this very show. And, they definitely seem to be... Oh, and they launched an education platform. So they're like really doing some interesting things in this space. But Musescore being like their desktop app, which is, totally free, and I would say by most accounts pretty intuitive to use. And then there's things like Noteflight and Flat.io, which are entirely web-based, maybe more analogous to Google Docs. And in my field, I see lots of educators saying that these web apps are just, our Musescore are just good enough. They don't need the professional engraving or the powerful playback or for every note to be perfectly spaced.
These web apps, you can't input with MIDI keyboard, right?
No, you can. I'm more familiar with Noteflight than I am Flat.
Okay. That's amazing that MIDI works with web browsers.
Yes. Yes, it's very cool. So another good one in this space is actually a web-based digital audio workstation called Soundtrap. And I know that one of their competitors is called BandLab. And Soundtrap, it was like pretty much the language of all my general music classes, music making this past school year during COVID. It's like because Soundtrap is really a Google Doc, but it's a DAW in the same, in the same breath. So you're in a DAW, but you can have like 5 or 6 or 7 or more kids in the same project at the same time, editing their own tracks and recording their own audio tracks with a microphone, maybe on one computer. Another kid can have a MIDI keyboard plugged into their Chromebook, and it can be like recording a software instrument, and this can all be happening more or less in real time.
Gotcha. Yeah. And where's Notion fall in? They have a desktop app. What are they? Kind of a smaller player?
I learned about Notion through their iPad app, so I actually I'm not prepared to say what came first, but I know that Percussionist owns them, and Notion, when at the time when I was really getting into creating and making stuff on my iPad, that was really one of the only options if you wanted a lot of features and a decent experience. So Notion, my gateway was their iPad app. I know Symphony Pro has been a competitor to them on the iPad, and I'd say that they have a lot of similar features. They definitely appeal to a similar kind of user, and I think they both use the same handwriting engine for converting Apple Pencil handwriting into notation. So I'd say like Notion is a great option. I would put it up there with like Musescore and Noteflight as like things that are, for at least for people in music teaching, things that are good enough that they don't necessarily even look at these what we would call maybe major pro desktop applications.
Gotcha. Yeah. And Dorico came out October 2016. So it's so young. It's like under 5 years old, which is just baffling how good this is. And that also, as we'll talk about once we get to Dorico, we're going to start with Sibelius, but just they have a fresher code base, so they're able to do things that perhaps Finale couldn't do because of how young they are and youthful their code base is.
Yeah, I got to interview Daniel Spreadberry, who's the product marketing manager of Dorico, on my own show, and he says that when they really first started sitting down to plan this app, they knew that they wanted it to run on the iPad pretty much from the very start. So while they had a lot of other priorities, didn't like paint themselves into a corner when they were writing the desktop version, the one that runs on Mac OS and Windows. They really left room, and they are now using a very similar code base and development framework to write the same app for both the iPad and Windows and the Mac.
Yeah, and I was listening to an interview with the Sibelius folks as well, and they were mentioning they also use the QTE framework as Dorico does. Is that not what kind of framework is that these apps are sharing? Do you know?
I would need to look up. So it might be worth linking to if people want to follow up on this. I believe there's a Wikipedia page of a whole bunch of apps that use Qt.
Okay.
And I think it's pronounced cute is how I think. And yeah, I mean it is. Here we go. I'm just hopping on there right now. So it's a really, really flexible development platform. I understand it to the extent that I understand that it does empower developers to write one set of code and then run an app on multiple different platforms.
Yeah, because in the Sibelius interview, it was kind of interesting. It's the old way of doing things. They were talking about Scorch is you have to write an app native for iPad, and then on the Mac, Objective-C or, and then the Qt came along. It's we can actually use this thing that is more comfortable to write in cross-platform and make stuff work now. And that's kind of how Sibelius and Dorico were able to come to iPad in as easy as a way, I should say. Probably wasn't easy, but as simple as a way that they could.
Yeah, Qt, it's extremely versatile. So it's hard quite to to say what it can and can't do. Everything from Ableton Live to VLC Media Player to Dorico to, I'm reading their Wikipedia page, Google Earth is apparently written in it. Yeah, so I mean it's Musescore is also written in it, OBS. So it's a really powerful and versatile framework. I'm not sure exactly when Sibelius started using it, but yeah, it's definitely able to do quite a bit. So, and I mean, we'll get into it a little bit, what are maybe some of the limitations or some of the things that we wish would come in the future of these iPad versions of these apps.
Right.
It's interesting to see that, the Qt framework is not necessarily, I mean, in some cases it can be limiting, but what the limiting factor really more is, I think, is just time of the developers. Do you know what I mean? You have to, at some point you have to ship something, and what you ship is a reflection of what you prioritize in terms of what you think is best for your users and what's going to also help you to thrive as a business. So so I don't see, I don't know enough about Qt to know exactly where it's limited, but we could get into maybe later. I know Dorico, obviously the Apple Pencil, there's a different Apple Pencil strategy on Sibelius and Dorico at launch, and I know that Qt definitely factors into that as far as it does have support for an external stylus. But what specifically it can do, it's not the same as someone writing an app using entirely Apple's technologies, where they can just borrow stuff that Apple has already written and released for the Apple Pencil, and just immediately you have native Apple Pencil integration. It's a lot more steps than that. But the benefit is then you can release your app on Windows, Mac, iPad, whatever else.
Yeah. So Sibelius and Dorico came out within 24 hours each other in the last week of July 2021. And how big of a shock was this to you as someone that follows this space pretty closely and has used Sibelius initially and now uses Dorico? Imagine the developers must also know each other pretty nicely or closely, as the Dorico devs came from Sibelius.
Sure. Yeah, so my understanding is to speak to the industry is that there was this was a coincidence that these two programs were ready within such a close time span of one another, even down to the day that they chose to make their announcements. I was, just to disclose, I've had Daniel Spreadberry on my podcast, years and years and years ago. He came on to my show, and creating an iPad version was something that I had talked about with him for a long time, and he was very generous to let me test this software. So I was actually not, the day that Dorico was released, I was not just in total shock about it. I kind of knew that it was coming.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Avid and Sibelius team had been kind of teasing for weeks in advance through some tweets that they had some sort of what appeared to be a mobile strategy. And I figured, it's been long enough since I've run Scorch on my iPad. It's probably got to be something a lot better than that, or else it wouldn't have taken them this long to make. So, and then it turns out that, that is Sibelius full Sibelius for iPad. And for me, I think what was just having not seen it before the day it was released. I mean, I guess we'll get into this in a little bit. Like just, the kind of design approach they had taken is, I guess, what's most interesting between these respective programs, more so than that they have one. I'm very, very glad that we have these two applications. I mean, they're both these huge achievements for both companies to produce. And, whether or not I personally was surprised or not by them, I would say that certainly a lot of the industry, I think, is excited that they're out there. I mean, there's a handful of people that are, really glued to their desktop when they do this kind of work, and they're just like, okay, cool, yeah, whatever. Like, wake me up when it's, not a subscription model, or wake me up when it's an Android, or all sorts of snarky things I've seen from various professionals. But I think the majority of people are like, yeah, okay, very, very cool that these exist. And in some cases, I mean, the Sibelius, they've been around a while. I think one reaction I've heard is like, finally, yes, the thing I've used is now with me everywhere.
Yeah. I was emailing Finale developers back in 2012, like, when are you guys coming to iPad? It's like, probably still a ways off. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to see, the future of what the software looks like. In the Sibelius interview, they talked about, the future is, iPads are part of the future. And like, I'll be curious to see how Finale adapts to the M1 world, and as things shift around and with their old code base, if they can still survive. They'll survive, but if they can attract new customers, which is important. So Sibelius, let's start there. And what is their version 1 kind of offer, and what is their approach to bring this app to iPad? And we should say this is version 1. And in the interview, they did mention the next 5 updates are going to be huge and bring something substantial to each of them. So I know they're hard at work, and this is just version 1.
Yeah, I think in both cases of each of these apps, there are new features and new design approaches, Dorico and Sibelius respectively, and I think that there will be like some of the features that have been added, and maybe even some of the design. I'm just sort of guessing here, but I know that with Dorico, that definitely they plan on their next desktop version, including some of the new features of their iPad offering. And I can only imagine that when the folks that develop Sibelius say that they probably are, speaking similarly, that maybe there are some things that actually, I assume you're referring to the scoring notes interview.
Yes. Great interview.
Great interview. Yeah. Worth listening to for anyone interested. Actually, that podcast is super. So anyone who really likes notation software, I can't imagine you don't know about the Scoring Notes blog and podcast, but they're excellent. And
they mentioned things like already on Windows, if you have a touchscreen like Surface, you can the dragging up and down type thing for note entry with the keypad that we'll talk about in a little bit here.
Right. I think that's the kind of thing that you can expect when you hear them say, okay, well, we've got like an exciting roadmap down the road. I mean, reintroducing for iPad, I think the Sibelius developers asked themselves like, okay, well, what is essential to our app that we fit into this both different device, but also the smaller display? And I think that it's, not out of the question that maybe some of the things that are good about it like that. I mean, they outright on the interview said that they already have the desktop version working with some of these new Apple Pencil gestures, but only using a mouse. And I think, I would personally speculate, like I wonder, because this iPad version of Sibelius has a much more native design to the platform than I feel like Sibelius on the Mac does. In other words, like the Sibelius on iPad app looks and feels more similar to like Pages or Keynote or Numbers on iPad than say like the desktop version of Sibelius feels like to those Mac counterparts. Like the Sibelius thing that I've knocked before is like that they have this like big like ribbon at the top of the desktop app that's got like a lot of like cluttered options in it that are sort of it's like a very Microsoft 2010 kind of, or whichever version it was that introduced that ribbon. I can't remember when, but yeah, it's this very like it's that kind of design interface, and it's something that for the better part of the last 8 years or so has been like really phased out as things have become a little bit more content focused, like a lot of software, even the web has become much more focused on the content. And in the interview that you're referencing, they even mentioned that like we want the iPad version to be just the score. Yeah, so like you just basically are interacting with your content, and there are not a whole lot of tools or buttons or knobs or whistles on the screen, which I mean, speaking from my perspective, I definitely appreciate that approach on the iPad.
Okay, yeah, they're very different approaches because Sibelius, it feels more iPad first, or, it's designed especially for this device. And Dorico, as we'll talk about, it's the desktop app on the iPad, which personally I like that approach because it also means we get all the features of the desktop app and we're not rebuilding the app. So maybe Sibelius's approach after these 5 big updates come out will be, oh, this is the right approach because I have all the features I want and they're done in a way that's all iPad-y versus Dorico's approach, which on version 1 is, for me, the right approach. But maybe, down the road, Sibelius will be the superior app.
Yeah, it comes back to this idea of like what makes a good iPad app and what makes a good iPad experience. Like, is it this idea that it is sort of like a digital piece of paper, or is it this idea that it can just be a really similar window into the same kinds of experiences you have on your other computing devices? And I think that these two approaches really, really highlight it. Like, and both of them are developed on the same code base that, like, they're built on the same code base as their desktop counterparts. So you're getting the core Dorico and the core Sibelius experience in numerous respects, which we could get into in a bit if you want. But I would say that like the code of paint that's sort of put before you in Sibelius for iPad definitely feels more native to the iPad. Like, for example, when you open it, you're taken immediately to the same interface as the Apple Files app. So and it features, you can open a document in place from anywhere in your filing system, edit it, and then save it back to that location without doing a whole bunch of round tripping or like exporting it from one app to the other. It just kind of works in the same way that, like, if you're on the Mac and you hit Command O, open, and then you get that little mini Finder window. Like, it's that same kind of idea. And, when you launch the app, you've got like a really kind of a sleek, thin toolbar with some kind of like lined style graphics that depict the different few tools that are on screen. There are not a whole lot of tools on screen. So yeah, definitely a very content forward, simplified experience as far as the UI is concerned. Whereas Dorico is more like they've really just taken the exact kind of user interface elements of the Mac and the Windows version and then put it on iPad. And they're two very different approaches, and I really appreciate things about each approach.
Yeah.
The Dorico team, I think the way that and this is like, maybe, I don't know how relevant it is to maybe say that we're having this conversation the same week that 1Password has announced that they're like making some changes to their next Mac version.
Yes, as an Electron app.
Yeah, I know Electron apps amongst people who are really serious Apple users get kind of knocked a lot, for not looking and behaving like Mac apps do. But the counter argument to that is that, okay, well, if you make an app that looks and behaves the same way on every platform, then is it in your user's best interest to give them the most native experience to each device they have, or to give them the experience that's native to your software? In which case, I think Dorico is saying, okay, well, if we give everyone the same Dorico everywhere, they're going to be more at home and more familiar, at least once they launch our app.
Yeah, you don't have to relearn anything.
Right.
Yeah. And as far as version 1, there's no MIDI keyboard support in Sibelius, which I'm sure they'll add one day. But so when I write music, what I want to do, and this is why Notion never really clicked for me, is when I went to college, this is what I'd go in the lobby of the music buildings, park myself down in there, and I'd have a big table out front, and I'd have my laptop in the middle, and I have a MIDI keyboard to one side of me and a external keyboard, QWERTY keyboard to the other side with a number pad, and I'd be improvising on the MIDI, and then when I find a note I like, I'd hit a number on the number pad, and then I'd enter that note, and I'd continue that process on of just improvising and hitting a number and continuing on. And that's kind of how I like to write music, and it's a lot of external hardware and a screen that I'm not touching or interacting with that much. And right now, Sibelius really wants you to be touching the screen and using the screen as your input kind of way to do it, which is great, I think, for probably a lot of people. Yeah, what are your thoughts on kind of their approach so far?
Yeah, it's interesting you say this. So, like, again, I have to say that my opinions are colored by the needs of, like, and the experiences of being a music teacher. So I am not actually, like, I think that these professional offerings are awesome. Like, I'm always going to try to find the thing that makes me the best at doing the job. And so, like, using a professional tier of software is always going to be something that I'm thinking about. But that doesn't mean that my actual needs are always the most advanced. So I'm not like particularly someone who is like power using every single feature of the software. Sometimes what's most powerful to me is if it just lets me get in and out of it quickly. It's for that reason that I feel like some of these iPad first experiences, I mean, like, we're not going to talk too much, I don't think, today about StaffPad, but StaffPad is like all the way on this extreme of like, it's not only an iPad first experience. It's an iPad only experience, or Windows tablet if you're using one.
You need an Apple Pencil, and it's all about writing, and it recognizes your handwriting, which I'm sad that approach didn't work for me, because I do like handwriting, music at times as a break from the normal way of doing things.
So while I am a really committed Dorico user, I think where Sibelius does really get something right here is that their app, even though it's got a lot of the power of Sibelius under the hood and a lot of the features, I think that I don't want to call it onboarding, but just the experience of working with the app feels a little bit lighter because of some of these iOS specific design conventions. So the fact that I open it and I don't have to think about importing something from my file system into it before I can work with it, the fact that it just shows me my file system, that's just one little tiny paper cut less of using the app.
Yeah, in Dorico, I have a shortcut automated setup. So every time I close the Dorico app, it backs up the Dorico local folder, because it saves everything locally on your iPad. It saves that from the Dorico local folder to an iCloud folder of Dorico, so it's backed up there. And if I did use a Mac, I could then access my iPad files. I guess if I was using a Mac, I would also have an automation when I open the app to import, move over the iCloud stuff back into Dorico. So yeah, with Sibelius, it's all just I'm using iCloud.
Right. Yeah. It really. It makes it feel nice. And the fact that it is very content forward and that you are able to interact more directly with the Apple Pencil, it certainly makes it feel like something that you could kind of get in and out of and use, to make some, it's the kind of thing where it's if you just need to make a quick worksheet or write out a quick melody, I feel like it's, it really works for me in that way.
And I really do like their keypad. I did try it out, and if I was just without any external hardware, their approach, I think, really works well. You're not touching the staff of the screen. You have your finger on this keypad, and you're dragging it up or down to change the note. And then, you can even use a number pad to get around that keypad as well. Yeah, so I think their approach is actually really good. It makes use of the finger in a way that makes sense, because a finger is a big thing that would cover elements of the screen.
Sure, yeah. And that was why I brought up StaffPad, was because while StaffPad is this iPad-only experience with the pencil, I think that Sibelius kind of finds this balance where you are feeling like you're taking advantage of it, and you can get in and out of it quickly, and you don't have to think too hard about learning anything. Even though touching the different rhythms with the pencil and then sliding up and down is not the most discoverable thing. Once you learn it, it's pretty easy and intuitive to do. I think it's a pretty nice implementation of Apple Pencil. Are there things I can imagine that are better? Maybe, but it's definitely has the precision of the pencil without sacrificing the kind of control you need as a user. Because with StaffPad, you don't always know what it's going to do with the notation you've scribbled on the screen.
You have to wait until it interprets it.
Right, and even when it doesn't interpret you correctly, there's really no recourse you have. But you can just try a million times to draw it neater, or more the way that it wants to interpret whatever rhythm or note value you have written down. But with Sibelius, you're always kind of seeing directly on the screen what the output is as you're dragging the pencil. So
yeah. And something they kind of talked about with the Apple Pencil is you can use the keypad to change the duration. And one setup they showcased is have one hand with the Apple Pencil in your hand, the other hand have the keypad handy to change duration. And they even showed you can move the keypad to the left side of the screen if you want to. What I really wish is if they would let me move it to the top left, because that's kind of the natural point of rest for me for that hand on the iPad, just balance-wise and everything. So I hope they make that tweak in the future.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. So I think what maybe just to come back to your original question that got us down this path is just sort of looking at a top level as Sibelius as a little bit more adaptive to iPad conventions, and Dorico as more just bringing the Dorico desktop experience over. I think that if you try to imagine where each of these iPad apps might be in a couple of years, it's if I were to imagine Dorico adding just a couple of those iPad isms, being able to work in split view, some sort of Apple Pencil story. The file one is the one that's most in my way right now with how I work. Adding some of those things, but then retaining the foundation of what they built seems more like the app that I want to be using every day than what Sibelius is today, but like with maybe a little bit more power under the hood. And that could just be because Dorico is what I've been using lately. But it is a very, very powerful app. Sibelius is powerful too, but they have taken a lot of those things that are in the ribbon on the Mac version, and they've condensed them into what they call the command search, which is basically like a little magnifying glass icon that contains, like, I think almost, I could say this almost literally, it contains everything that the app can do that isn't basic note input, like rhythm and pitch.
And something that I heard is that search, it's great if you know what you're searching for, but it's not the most great if it doesn't have like synonyms of the thing you're searching for. So if you're not knowing what Sibelius calls it, good luck finding it.
Yeah, that is definitely like the right critique, I think. Like the benefit is that everything is in the same place. And I do get that. Like I think about certain like kind of like power user note and task apps that I've tried and used, where like you have sort of like a almost like a command open option, where you basically a keyboard shortcut that when you start typing text, it's looking at every project name, every folder, every task name, every note associated with every task. It's basically just like going to show you the thing you want in as few keystrokes as possible. And I think that that's that's kind of like the ideal situation. And I do appreciate that Sibelius has said, hey, guess what? We've made the user interface is super clean and super content forward. And then you can actually, through powerful commands, get to literally anything you need in the quickest way. The problem is, yes, what you've just said. Like, you need to know exactly the phrasing, the name of the feature. You need to even know how it's spelled. For example, I wanted to take a melody I had written and have a third higher added to every note. So I dragged with my finger, selected the section, and then on a computer keyboard you can do on Sibelius Shift 3, we'll just add a third higher to whatever note is selected. I wanted to try the command search because I thought this would be, there's no button on screen to do it. I was holding it without the keyboard attached. So I went there and went to the search and I typed in the word third, spelled out THIRD, and nothing came up. And I thought, So I deleted, my search entry, and then I typed in the number 3, RD, third, and it came up.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking to myself, like, even knowing which one they want, I can see myself like that being a little bit of cognitive overhead. Like if I'm in the middle of a busy project, I just sometimes I'm going to type out the word instead of the number 3 RD. And so definitely it's a really, really good idea. I think that it could stand to be easier to find stuff in that menu.
Right. And their approach is kind of like the create menu. I think that's pretty nice. Like there's elements of Sibelius that the UI is kind of nice. I hated the ribbon in college. That was one of the most confusing things. And also the note entry itself didn't jive with me. Like the finale way is kind of what the Dorico way is, it feels like, of the improvising and hitting the numbers and stuff. And I will say keyboard commands. If you have a QWERTY keyboard, those are all pretty much there, both Sibelius and Dorico. And Dorico even lets you customize them in a special preference pane. Sibelius and Dorico also don't use the hold command key to show you all the keyboard shortcuts. Even though Sibelius is kind of iPad first, that part of it didn't translate over, probably because there's so many keyboard shortcuts. Maybe they were worried it'd be like 1,000 pages and it might get confusing.
Yeah, it could also be that they wrote the apps in Qt, but I'm wondering though, I mean, that seems like something that you could, because you do not have to develop an app in one framework. I mean, you can add Apple, I mean, in the same way that Sibelius is also a Qt app, but that they have like the file, the open in place file thing, like that you can combine with other Apple features. Don't know enough about development to know what it takes to add that little cheat sheet to the bottom of the screen. I mean, certainly the Dorico key commands. I mean, anything that Dorico can do. That's the thing that someone who's unfamiliar with these apps needs to know is like the kinds of things that you can do. Like there are hundreds, if not thousands, of actions that you can take in an app. It's not like where you are in Pages and you go to the, up to the menu bar and you like every single thing the app can do can be like nested within like 6 or 7 different submenus. Like these things do so much, and with Dorico you can actually go in. I mean, I kind of freaked out. It was the reason I knew that this was going to be a great release was when I saw that the same custom keyboard shortcut manager from the Mac version was in the iPad version. It's the same thing you would expect, like if you're running Pro Tools or Logic or any one of these programs that has such an advanced feature set that they allow you to take any small little task that you might do, and then add a key command to it. So I don't think that they would fit if they tried to shove that into that little cheat sheet interface that Apple does. But I very, very, very much appreciate, how much you can do to customize it.
Yeah. And the company that makes those special keyboards has a Dorico keyboard. I'm kind of tempted to get a external Dorico keyboard with all the keyboard shortcuts etched right in there. I'd love if they'd made like a Magic Keyboard case with the like for iPad, like if they bought up some Magic Keyboards for iPad and sold custom keyboards in that way. That'd be kind of interesting.
It's makes me wonder, like, there's I don't, you don't need to, I guess this is rhetorical, because it's like I'm fully aware why this isn't something that I can hold in my hands today, but the idea of like having keys on a keyboard, like, that are just have fixed letters on them in the first place seems, I don't know, and with the advent of iOS sort of like having your whole screen just become the experience, it seems interesting to me that no one has really chased this idea yet of, well, like, okay, but the keyboard, obviously, like, it would be super expensive and impractical maybe to put like little LCD screens underneath each key. But it seems
Apple would love to sell you $1,000 Magic Keyboard for iPad that is just custom LEDs on every key.
I'm sure they would. So for whatever of the many reasons I can imagine that does not exist, it would be super cool. Because the reason I never buy one of those little sticky keypad things is because, it's like, okay, well, now I just have Dorico stickers on. Like, what if I'm running Pro Tools? I would love to have a set of Pro Tools stickers to remind me where
you need 10 keyboards to get through your day.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and with Dorico, the thing that's cool about that that I'm always trying to keep in the back of my mind, and what I think makes it such a great piece of software, one of the things that makes me most efficient anyway, is this feature called the keyboard popovers. Mm-hmm. And they've got like 10 or more of these like letters on the keyboard where if you hold shift and press that letter, it sort of like puts up a little box where you can start typing into. And they have this whole syntax that's all typed from the computer keyboard of like things that you can insert into the music just from the keyboard. So like, for example, rather than in Sibelius, for example, if I wanted to have the music go from piano to mezzo forte to piano again, and then have like it crescendo, between those dynamics, and then diminuendo, I would have to like insert expression markings for the piano. I'm sorry, text markings for the piano, for the mezzo forte, and for the piano. And then actually hairpins are from a different part of Sibelius. They're treated as lines because they're technically they're like graphics that appear on the screen. And so, like, Dorico is sort of more looping all of these together. Like, it understands that all of those commands, even though they look different, they all relate to the dynamics. What you can do is you can hold Shift D for dynamics, and then a little pop-up will appear, and then there's like a number of things you can type straight from the keyboard that are, I don't want to call them natural English, because like some of them are abbreviations, and there's like symbols and letters and numbers you need to use. But if you type P for piano, less than sign for the crescendo marking, MF, less greater than sign, and then P, it'll actually like notate that as a piano with a hairpin to a mezzo forte with a hairpin to a piano, all underneath of whatever the selected passage was. And when I first saw that happen, I was like, this is nuts. Like, this is so crazy that you can have this keyboard first kind of system for entering almost any kind of notation you would want. And on the iPad, they've created a really clever button on the screen that brings one of those up if the keyboard is not attached.
Yeah.
But and then you choose the type of popover you want to initiate, and then the on-screen keyboard flips up from the bottom and allows you to type in whatever you want. So pretty clever.
Yeah, and I've been finding that super handy. Add, more bars to your score in that way.
Yeah, so like Shift M, and then a little pop-up appears. Let's just say you want to add 5 measures to the end of your score, or from wherever you have selected. Shift M does the pop-up, and then you hit the plus. You type plus, and then the number of measures you want, and enter, and then it just adds them.
Yeah. And the whole system of using a keyboard to get around is super handy. And I also, you told me this about Dorico, is you don't input rests. You instead, you tell the system what kind of rhythmic grid you want to be using. So I have it set to 1/8 notes. So every time I cursor to like arrow through, it's an 1/8 note. So if I just want to enter an 1/8 note or a 1/4 note rest, I can just use the grid to fast forward through that measure, and then that's when I start to input my next note, and it'll just magically put in the rest. And that seems to work really, really well. And I was kind of surprised how much I liked it, because in the old way of doing it, I remember, if I want to enter a rest, I just don't play anything on the MIDI keyboard, and then I hit a number key, and but this method seems to work pretty nice.
Yeah, Dorico is really intuitive for people who are coming from the experience of producing music in a digital audio workstation. Like the idea of music, there being no sound as sort of just being like empty space and time versus an actual like rest symbol that needs to be inserted with the same intention as a note head is. Like the DAW method would be like, okay, we'll just pencil in where you want the sounds to happen on this piano roll using the keyboard and mouse. Whereas something like Sibelius is you're like actively entering the rest. You're saying like, okay, I know there's going to be a rest here. What kind of duration is that rest? Okay, enter the rest. And now the note, whereas Dorico is really just saying, what's the duration of the note? And then where do you want it to start? And we'll figure out all of the notation that needs to happen in between the last thing you typed and the thing you're typing now. And it's an intuitive approach that I think is in part, they're leveraging. I think one of their strengths is that they're leveraging some of the technologies of Cubase, which is, Steinberg, who makes Cubase, is also, who the Dorico team works for. So Steinberg is sort of like, I think they're taking in some cases, some of the actual technologies from Cubase, and in some cases just the inspiration from Cubase to determine how they approach the entry of notation. And this comes down also to their Playback Engine, which is one of the things that is like definitely a strength of Dorico on iPad, is if you hit Command 4 and you go into play mode, you have the same play mode on the iPad that you have on the Mac. And it's very, very customizable. I mean, you can look at a histogram of like note velocity on a per track basis. You can like change the audio output. Like you can choose the software instrument for each voice using audio units on iOS. You can there's this great on-screen mixer that allows you to actually some of the great things about the iPad app are that you can now see some of this stuff even when you're like in the mode that's designed for writing.
Yeah.
So like you can be writing your score, and then some of these features that used to be in play mode, actually now you can see at the same time. So you can now see like a mixer at the bottom of the screen while you're actually inputting your notes. One cool thing they added to the iPad version, which is coming to the next desktop version, is it's they call it the key editor, but it's more or less a piano roll that actually shows you the notes of whatever instrument is selected in, like with the piano going vertically on the left, and then sort of like in the same way that you can like in a digital audio workstation just click and drag any note as depicted by a little colorful rectangle and drag the right end of it to make it last longer or shorter, or you can drag it up and down to change pitch or left and right to change rhythm. And there's times where this is actually, at least for my brain, a pretty intuitive way to work with notation.
Yeah, and there's a mode where it changes the actual notation, and then there's also a mode where it just changes the performance, because sometimes you just want it to sound different.
Exactly, right. And that's the thing with play mode, is I think Dorico's philosophy, just to speak more to what they're doing across all platforms, not just on iPad, but they're very, very focused on engraving and making sure that the music looks as beautiful and legible as possible, whether by it be their excellent defaults. Like it by default gets the best looking score of any program I've used. And I'm talking about the spacing between the notes, like the font, how it handles like the different kinds of like musical fonts. Like it gets the most legible and beautiful score without tweaking anything. But even if it doesn't, then it has all these crazy tweaks you can do. It has a whole mode called Engrave Mode that is just designed to make the score and the notation look a certain way without actually altering the notation that you've input into the system. And play mode is the same way. It's only you're now editing the sound, the playback that you hear, without actually changing any of the notation that you've entered, versus something like Sibelius, whereas like it's all in the same interface, which for better or worse, I mean, that means that you are not entering into using different tools or different modes to determine note input versus layout, but then there can be quirks, like you can accidentally drag a symbol off, the side margin of the screen and not be able to find it. Whereas Dorico sort of says, okay, like if this note is a mezzo forte, well, when you're writing the score, you tell us that note is a mezzo forte note. You put the symbol underneath it, great. And then in Engrave Mode, you can do any wacky, crazy thing with that mezzo forte that you want. You can move it like 6 pages to the right, and it's still going to know that note is the one that's the mezzo forte note. You can make the stems of the notes be like little stubs. You can like even bring in your own image files to, and then define different kinds of notation by these image files. I think actually it was on that same interview or a recent one on that Scoring Notes podcast they were talking about, you could do, I think David McDonald said, as you could literally like bring in a Mickey Mouse head as your note head style.
Oh, that's
so
great.
Yeah, so I mean, there's just a ton that you can do.
Something I hope the mixer one day adds is the ability to, as it's performing, I haven't input any dynamics at all. I want to just mix and have the dynamics kind of be inputted and written for me as I mix. Do you see that as a thing that they'll ever consider doing?
I really like the way you're thinking about that, because that's like a very digital audio workstation kind of approach to things. It's the idea of automating the, some sort of feature of the audio playback only by say taking that parameter and then mapping it to some sort of like actual physical input that you're going to do in real time and then having it. So like, for example, if I were using a synthesizer in a digital audio workstation, I could map some sort of like EQ or some sort of filter to a knob on my keyboard and then, hit the record button. And as I turn that knob, I have the benefit of this like very, very tactile physical control that I'm moving with my hand on the keyboard, but then the software is like, mapping the amount of filter or volume or panning or whatever to that in real time. And I think that would they add it? I don't know how high on Dorico's priority list it is, but given that they're taking so many cues from Cubase, I have to wonder if it would be maybe like I don't know. I'm gonna actually put in a request to the forum and see if I get any response to that, because I don't think that would be a very hard thing for them to implement based on the foundation they have. I mean, there are not as many parameters that I can think of that you would automate. I mean, and I'm just to say this again, I'm not someone who does a ton with playback, just because usually I'm making pretty simple resources with the software. But back when I was doing
the mixer today is only used for playback, right? It's only used to optimize how it sounds for the final output, right?
Yeah, so it's not, you're not going to be able to hit record and then like take the master volume and like slowly drag it down to get it to imitate a decrescendo.
Right, yeah.
Are you suggesting that the actual, like, that doing that would change the playback permanently, or that it would actually like write the notation of a diminuendo in the...
Right, it. Yeah, and then I could tweak it after it interprets what it has written in the score for me.
That seems a little bit more...
Because you have a track-by-track mixer. So like a clarinet, you have a mixer just for that instrument. And you could even do multiple passes where on this playback, I'm going to do the clarinet and mix that and have it write out what it interprets for that, Yeah,
exactly. That's an interesting way to think about inputting notation through a MIDI controller. I really like that. I've never actually considered like the idea of it writing the notation based on... Really, I'm used to MIDI controllers just doing rhythm and pitch. So
yeah, writing dynamics currently it's just an on-screen mixer. But if you are able to program a knob on a MIDI keyboard to do that, that would be even more tactile and useful, I think.
Right. Yeah, I wonder if it'd almost be the inverse problem that you get by, because these scores never really sound exactly like they're going to sound when you have them played by real musicians. And I wonder if it would be almost like the reverse problem. Like, would it ever be able to really properly, determine the dynamic that you had intended based on how...
It would have to be in context of here's your entire piece of music and I think it'd just be a good starting point to work from, as in like when you hit record, I never do this. You can have it do a click track and have it interpret your performance into notes and rhythms and stuff. I never find that accurate enough because I'm too sloppy of a player to make that accurate enough for me. I know some people have success with it, but it's almost like that where it gives you the rough interpretation. Then from there, you can change the dynamics appropriately.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, one of the reasons I don't do a lot of MIDI input isn't because I don't like to. It's just because so much of the time I'm on a laptop or an iPad.
And you're not like pulling out the whole setup. Let me get my external keyboard plugged in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I almost like, I love the idea of having different kinds of like workstations that I dock my device into, but the iPad specifically is never something that I've thought of. Well, I guess not the Mac either. I've never really think of them as these kinds of things where it's like I want to have extra peripherals in my bag when I'm on the go. Like the fun of having them be so portable is that I don't have extra stuff in my bag.
Yeah, the keyboard you recommend to me, it's great. It's the K-Key 25, I believe it's called. It's a USB keyboard, a MIDI keyboard. It's micro USB, but they have these wonderful cables that are micro USB to USB-C. So I can plug directly into it with a single cable into my iPad Pro and have a MIDI keyboard with me and be off to the races doing really awesome input on the go with this thing. And I love I got a little bundle that came with a keyboard sleeve for that MIDI keyboard. And it also fits in that sleeve. I can throw in an external Magic keyboard, a Magic trackpad in that thing. I've got an external number pad I can throw in that little sleeve. So I've got like all these input devices in this little keyboard sleeve now that I'm just finding a lot of joy with.
Is it that like same black and orange one?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I never even thought about trying to put more stuff in it. That's good to know it'll fit so much.
Yeah, it totally fits. Yeah, it fits because the external Magic keyboard, I've got one of those. It's just super thin, so you can fit that in. I've got this external Bluetooth number pad as well, which I find really useful with Dorico. And then, I've got the little USB-C to micro USB cable in there as well. So, yeah, pretty handy.
Yeah, that C key, it's like... I like that team just kind of thought to themselves, okay, like how do we make a little MIDI keyboard that really just spiritually looks and feels like the Apple Magic keyboard, and they but we don't try to over-engineer it to the point where it's like this expensive premium product. We just make it somewhat affordable and accessible, and I really like that they've sort of nailed that. I mean, it's got that same sort of aluminum look to like the base of it with like the white keys just sort of like ever so slightly sticking out of the top of it with just enough, it's just, they have just the amount of give to them that I would expect something so skinny to have. But while sort of, still, I feel like I am in control over tapping with some amount of rhythm and precision when I'm recording in real time.
And it's got the octave keys nice and handy, so you're going to be jumping up and down really easily for that, which is great. I played around a bit with it's got like bending of pitches, and I don't use that as much, but yeah, it's got all the basics you'd want from a keyboard.
Yeah, I like it. I have one on my desk at work because I don't keep a full-sized, piano keyboard like I do in my home studio at work.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it's like $100. Yeah, really good option there. So Sibelius, I want to touch a couple more things on Sibelius. They mentioned on their blog post, which is really in depth. If you're gonna get into Sibelius, I'd recommend reading their blog post because they do point out a lot of cool things about the app. You can use the trackpad to input notes, which it's kind of interesting, but I found it a bit frustrating that it didn't preview kind of what note I'm actually inputting. I wonder if they'll ever do that, because I know on iPad you can have magnetized pointers and kind of shape the note head to be different things. And I wonder if they'll end up getting into making that a really cool experience, because you could do interesting things with that, because the pointer on iPad is so customizable these days.
That's another one of those things where I don't know what the limitations of Qt are, or to what extent you can customize it with using a little bit of Apple's APIs in combination with other frameworks, because I know very much so the cursor sort of morphing and changing into whatever it's hovering over is very much a technology that Apple provides some tools to integrate into your software. Obviously Dorico and Sibelius, neither of them have that amount of flexibility with the cursor. In fact, I would even say the trackpad, the Magic trackpad in particular, is something that does not feel really native. And in me as a Dorico and a Sibelius keyboard user, I really like to input notes from the computer keys themselves. So the fact that the most, the thing that's right under my finger is the trackpad, not the screen in that case. And the fact that I know in Dorico, you can't 2-finger scroll through your score like you can on the desktop version. Sibelius is the same. In fact, Sibelius, so you can click and drag because, of course, when the trackpad is not employed natively, it behaves just like a finger. So, obviously, because a finger can touch and drag the score one direction or the other, you can click somewhere where there aren't notes in a Sibelius or a Dorico score and move it. But and then even Sibelius on, when you're interacting directly with touch, it doesn't have the more inertia kind of based model. So the second that your finger leaves the screen, it doesn't keep moving. Mm-hmm. It just sort of stops cold, which makes it, if you're doing a multi-page score, that means you're just, lifting your finger off. You're doing a workout to move the screen. So I don't know. I think those would be things that I would want to see before anything adaptive to the screen. But looking here at the top of Sibelius, for example, the toolbar does not look unlike other toolbars that I've seen in Apple's own apps. So I don't know how much custom code they have here, but from the look of it, at least, it seems like it wouldn't be out of the question that maybe some of these buttons, when you hover over them, would kind of be a little stickier.
And even when you're doing note input with a trackpad, I'd love showing me what ledger line I'm about to input when I click.
Yeah, I'm actually, and that was the first part of your question. So I'm just like in a score right now. Sorry, I moved away from my microphone to say that. I'm just like, so I've got a note selected, and unlike the desktop version where you sort of see a preview of which line or space the note is on, you're sort of blind. But if you use the Apple Pencil, you get the preview that you would with a mouse. So that again, that seems like something that is like a native Magic Keyboard trackpad feature that I could totally see both of these developers doing more with down the road.
Yeah, and the Apple Pencil and Sibelius, it's a really interesting approach. I think you need to spend some time to really learn and master it, because I did just play around with it, and the tilting and pressure stuff, I found it just a bit tricky from the get-go, but I think if you spend some time with it, you can really master it, as you kind of need to master the software for learning some of it, at least.
Right. Yeah. The whole like taking your pencil and like, okay, because like on one level, if you touch the Apple Pencil to the type of rhythm or like note value or symbol that you want, and then you drag up and down, you're choosing which pitch you enter. And if you drag it left and right, you're choosing like, is there a sharp or a flat before it? That works really well for me. But then there's like this other kind of pencil mode you can go into, which is what you're talking about, which is the one where like you can like directly touch the Apple Pencil to where on the staff you want the note to appear. But then if you like tilt it to the left, it'll like change whether or not it's got a sharp or a flat, or the duration of the note, like based on how high, like how up or down, left and right the pencil is tilted. But like, I don't know I don't know if you tried to do this, but if you tried to get certain duration, like let's just say you try to get like a 30-second note with a flat symbol in front of it, like the way you have to contort your hand with the pencil is already uncomfortable enough. Then try actually lifting it off the screen to input the note you see there without making some sort of change when you lift your hand off the screen. Yeah, it's tricky. I don't know. I'm curious if they can have a way to collect data on who uses which input methods inside of the application, and I would be really curious to know if anyone really gets into that sort of part of the pencil input. I don't think it's for me.
Yeah, and Sibelius also, they do use dark mode, which is kind of cool. So they are like trying to integrate as much of the system-wide stuff as they're able to, which is really nice.
Yeah, Dorico has this like kind of like pro app, like we're always in dark mode kind of a thing going on. Like all the tools and everything are always this kind of like dark bluish or dark grayish.
It'd be fun if Sibelius did have like a true dark mode where like the notes are white and like it's like very dark and like it's not like white staff paper behind it and stuff, and so it's like white line.
Yeah, I think right. I think a lot of developers really want to do that right, and that's why so few of them do it. But I was just using an app that I'm sure you're familiar with, DevonThink, to look at a textbook that had some musical notation in it.
Yeah, it does the inversion thing with everything, right?
Yeah, so when you're in dark mode, it just inverts the color. And I mean, it was a scan of a couple of pages from some text, and it was, so you could obviously, like in places where there was a little bit of shadow from the camera having taken a picture of the page, that was like now like inverted. So it was like white where there was like black from the shadow of the phone. But it didn't bother me at all. I thought to myself, like, I'm not really thinking about, how like I'm not thinking about how this isn't optimized for the app nearly as much as when I'm in light mode, or rather when I'm in dark mode and then like I'm dealing with a white document and like how blinding it is.
Right. Yeah.
It's so much more noticeable to me. So I would almost rather just take the shortcut to like, more or less just invert the colors of these kinds of documents.
Because Sibelius' dark mode basically frames your score in a dark interface versus something the whole, which is, that's one approach to take for now. So in Dorico's interview, they mentioned the M1 Mac really was an instigator of this whole project, because they knew, we're going to have to do some porting to this new chip. Let's just do it on iPad as well.
Yeah, totally. I think this is like, again, one of the things that we keep hitting back at is like when you can find that the way that you're writing your software, can be done one time and can scale all sorts of various different ways. I think that is eventually better for everyone, because I think in my conversation with Daniel from Dorico, and I think in the conversation we keep referencing with some of the Sibelius team, you get the idea that these decisions were not made in this vacuum, where they were like, spent whatever number of months they did and said like, okay, we're making our iPad app, and what is the iPad app? And I think it's actually they're being developed more holistically, like, okay, what is like the direction that our software is going, and what does it mean to have mobile software, and what questions do we have to ask about our software because of this mobile version that might then come back and influence the desktop version, or what things make sense to just go out in step all across all devices. Like, do we really need to have these two separate releases? And I think what we'll see is some of the features of both programs will come back to the desktop in the next year or two. And then I think probably moving forward into the future, my hope is that, because this years-long foundation has been built, that it won't be like the iPad is lagging behind the Mac for so long in the future. Instead, we'll just be seeing like regular updates to these kinds of programs that have all the same features across all platforms.
Yeah. I really want to see the movie scoring mode in Dorico come to iPad. I don't know if it's the multi-window thing that Dorico probably needs to have. I don't know how they do it on the Mac, but they may need to utilize multiple windows on the Mac, and maybe that's what's holding that up.
They I think are open to, as was when I talked to Daniel Spreadberry, they're open to the idea of doing more with the app. I think, this is definitely a new space for this kind of tier of professional scoring software. To be on the iPad is definitely like a bold and new move, I think, for both companies. And I think there's going to be some user feedback as well. How is it received? Who subscribes? What kind of feedback do you get about which features the people who are actually using the software really want? I think that's going to in turn influence the future of this software in a virtuous kind of way.
Yeah, because with the movie score, I could see you hooking up to an external monitor and have the movie displayed there while you're working on your score on your main screen, and that could a setup that's used. It's the do you spend the resources doing that? Will enough people use it? I think they do have the potential and will expand their user base. You have people like me that wrote music in college and kind of moved on with their life and are getting back into it because the iPad's their main device. And hey, here's Dorico or Sibelius.
Right, and the point I was making about Dorico and talking with Daniel Spreadberry a moment ago is that I think that through that cycle of user feedback, I think that it is definitely something they've considered to have like a more of a pro tier, because like basically Dorico for iPad is the free version is really quite similar to their desktop offering, which is also free.
Yeah, and we should mention both apps have free tiers, totally free. You can write music that's just a couple saves. I think 4 for Sibelius, and with Dorico you get 2 for free, and then if you sign in with the Steinberg account, you get 4. That's free as well. And then they have different subscription tiers from there. And Dorico is just one subscription. It's $4 a month or $40 a year, which is dirt cheap for what you're getting, I think. And
exactly.
Sibelius has a range of different tiers.
Yeah, and so Dorico's paid tier brings it in line with their middle tier on the desktop.
Elements tier, and then they have one higher for desktop as well.
Correct. Yeah, they have a pro version. Now, their middle tier on iPad does some of the stuff with the pro version.
Because they unlocked unlimited saves as well for that tier, so that's more than you would on the desktop, which I think maxed at 16?
Right, and there's some engraving mode features that are on the iPad version once you're a paying subscriber that are not in the middle tier of the desktop version as well.
Yeah, so it's kind of a hybrid. And
then I think and then Sibelius sort of has like a list of features that are in the various 3 tiers of their own app, which are there are obviously like asterisks for all of the things that we're saying. But
it's like this one's on desktop, this one's not. And if you just subscribe on iPad, the pricing is cheaper. So you can just sign in with your, if you're a current Sibelius user, you can sign up with your current subscription just fine. But if you just want to use it on iPad, you get I think it's $3 off their first tier, and
Right, and I think the features are somewhat in line as well with the desktop version. With again some of those asterisks, I can't mention them all because I'm sure there's lots of little
there are a lot
details in fine print. But for the most part, the things that you expect to do with Sibelius First, which is their free tier, you should expect to be able to do with it on your iPad if you're logged in to an account that's subscribed to Sibelius First on the desktop. And then the same goes with their middle tier Sibelius, and then their higher tier Sibelius Ultimate. So yeah, and that's an interesting approach, because like Dorico is a one-time purchase on the desktop and then a subscription on the iPad. Mm-hmm. And they told me very clearly that they are not going to a subscription model for the desktop. But if they ever offered one alternatively that gave you a bundle of the iOS and the Mac version, I would certainly consider it.
Yeah, I think they'd probably always offer a standalone, as Daniel said, because that's what their users expect and want, but doesn't stop them from adding a subscription and seeing how many people want that.
Yep.
So Dorico, getting started with setting up your score, is there anything of note that you want to point out about that setup process? Flows I want to talk about as well. That's part of the setup process. One thing I love about the setup tab is you can just go back to the setup tab at any point in time and add a new flow or change it up a bit. It's not like you set it up and then you're set up and you're done.
Right. So from the moment that you open Dorico, you are taken to a hub, which is, as you know, like many apps will have kind of like a custom onboarding screen, or rather what's launch screen, I should say, which kind of, like Microsoft Office is an example of this. They have their own sort of like, hey, here's some recent documents you open, or like, do you want to create a new thing from a template? And Dorico is the same. So rather than like in the case of Sibelius, where you just see, like a giant depiction of the Apple Files app, you see some of your recently opened scores, and you can open one. You have the option to create new, and then there's a little learn area where you can learn some of the features of the software. From there, anything that is already on your iPad can be opened and worked with immediately. But then there's also like an import button in the lower left corner, which can bring in Dorico projects from the file system, or it can open XML files, which is a type of file that can sort of like be passed between these different programs.
What's your success been with passing stuff around the various notation apps? Like if I wanted to do some handwriting in a staff pad.
Yeah, I did that the other day, actually. So I think that for really simple writing, StaffPad is sometimes pretty fast and efficient. I actually have been doing time trials in preparation for all of my various things, like this talk and the things I've been doing on my blog and podcast. And I'm planning eventually to do some more comparative kind of stuff on my blog about this software. But I've been doing some time trials to see how fast I input notes in each of them.
Yeah.
And there are times where for really, really simple rhythms, StaffPad is actually really, really quick. So there was just the other day, I was writing something in Dorico, and I had a melodic idea that was it was simple, but it was a little bit less repetitive. I was doing lots of copying and pasting in my accompanying instruments. And I just bounced over to StaffPad real quick, wrote out like an 8/16 measure melody, saved it as an XML file, and then went back into Dorico and then imported it. And it looks great. Again, I'm not the kind of user who's really using lots, like doing lots with layout, or even like too much with like the different flows or anything like that. So I don't know. I might not be the best person to criticize XML. It works pretty well for my needs. Things generally look a little funny when you're done importing. The simpler the score, the better results you get.
Yeah, if you don't put dynamics in quite yet, that'll behave better.
Yeah, I mean, like every program unfortunately has different ways that it interprets XML, and some interpret all of the data that's in the XML file, some don't. The one thing I'll say about Dorico, which is a strength, is that what it does with what it gets is generally it looks very, very good. Yeah. So it takes things like the spacing and the note alignment and the rhythm, and it sort of like beams things in an intuitive way to read. It has very, very, very good defaults for that kind of thing. And so it works for my needs about as well as I could expect. One thing I do a lot in the music classroom is take real physical sheet music, and then I use, there's a handful of scanning apps they're kind of like OCR, but for XML. So they take the notation on the page, and then they convert it into an XML, a MIDI, or an audio file, which can then be, used for whatever. But most often in my case, I am taking that and then importing it into one of these score programs where I can clean it up a little bit and then maybe add some things, maybe transpose it, or like write it, take copy and paste it from one instrument to another instrument and then make a worksheet out of it, this kind of thing.
Gotcha. Yeah. And yeah, the flows I really like. That's kind of what Dorico, people call it movement sometimes. And what I'm using this for, so in the sub screen, you can add these different flows and have different instruments in each of them if you want to. And because I just do these little short compositions on a regular basis, and I don't want to have 1,000 different little projects. Instead, I'm doing like a music journal, like August, like I have a August journal, and each day I can put a different flow and just title it with the day's date. And just have this, 30 to 50 bar, diary entry, basically, if you want to say it like that, for today. And I really find that kind of clicks really well with me to be able to just really elegantly have 12 files in a year. Almost.
Yeah, sort of unrelated to the idea of like what these programs do and don't do. I mean, I was sort of, as we were talking about that, I think that that's just a very cool, creative exercise to just sort of have this to try to almost like write something every day and to then use it, because that was not a thought that I'd ever had for how to use the flows feature of Dorico, was this idea of like, hey, let me just have like a little music journal or something that, you're writing in. And yeah, I mean, it's absolutely the point of it, is that you can take all of this information and sort of like store it in the same project, whereas in other programs that might be redundant information. The best way to, I think, for those who are, have some sort of musical know-how and don't really follow the whole flows thing, like if you're like writing a symphony with multiple movements, I think maybe the like most straightforward way of explaining a flow is like those might have to be separate projects. Or it would be one project and you'd have to do a whole lot of fiddling around with layout to get it to look like 4 separate ideas within one big project. Whereas Dorico sort of has this whole system of understanding that the different flows, so to speak, of musical thought are independent but related to one another and can sort of be interacted with in their own right, but then have this context in the greater whole. So you can like drag around and reorder them if you want to. In fact, it works the same with players. So it thinks of players and instruments as different things. Like if you're looking at a score in most of these programs, player and instrument are not distinguished from one another. So if there's a flute part in the score, it's assumed there's just someone playing the flute when you go to print the score and then hand it out to your musicians. Whereas Dorico says, hey, there are times where like you have someone on a gig who is like doubling instruments. So they're playing like flute, tenor sax, and alto sax, and clarinet. What if we can understand in the score that there's actually one player playing all 4 of these different instruments in the score, and can we make connections in that way?
Musicals will do this all the time.
Exactly.
No, it's really cool. What are some of your most used keyboard shortcuts in Dorico?
Okay, so obviously like changing the duration of the note with the numbers is a big one, and then just like inputting pitch using the letters of the keyboard is kind of like the main entry.
Yeah. And then you're able to go up and down octaves as well with some extra keyboard shortcut from there, right?
I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to forget to say that. Yeah, so whatever note is selected orange, this is something that I, to this day, still struggle with coming from Sibelius, because Sibelius, if a note is active and you move the arrow keys up and down, it'll change pitch. Whereas Dorico uses the arrow keys to change which note is selected. And then if you hold the Option key, you can move it up and down on the staff. So let's say I'm like writing a flute part and the very first note is orange and it's the active note, I can hit right on the keyboard over and over again to have, basically just like move through the different notes of my flute part. And then once I've found one that I want to change, I hold Option key and then the up and down arrows to move it up and down the lines and spaces of the staff. Holding down the Shift key with the Option key, or is it Command, will jump an octave, which is a pretty useful one as well. I think I don't want to mess this up. You can look it up maybe if someone actually wants to do this, but something that I'll do often is like I'm working in a band score and I'm making an exercise, like a scale exercise sheet for everyone in the class. So I basically need the same notes in all 14 or whatever different instrument voices. And so what I'll do is I'll write it out for flute, and I think it's Option Command M. It's something with modifier keys and M, but basically what it does is it just takes whatever is on that instrument and then it just like copies and pastes it onto the instrument below that.
Okay.
And then below that. And then below that.
And then you can use the transpose thing to make it the right octave for them if needed.
Correct. Yeah, then I just use Option, Command, up and down arrow to change the octave so that it's in the right range. And then I use the popovers quite a bit. So Shift D for dynamics, I use that. Shift A for rehearsal, adding a rehearsal marking to whatever part of your score is selected. Shift B, as we mentioned earlier, for adding and subtracting bars from the end or from anywhere in your score. Let me look at all the popovers here. There's just so many of them. And there's a...
Yeah, and there's like 2 modes on the right toolbar. There's like the mode where it's doing the popover, and then there's a different mode where you're like clicking on it instead.
Are you talking about the little palette in the keyboard?
Yeah.
I think the idea there is that so when you have the keyboard tapped on and you're not attached to a keyboard. I'm sorry, I'm saying the word keyboard in many different contexts in the same sentence. So when say the Magic Keyboard is not attached to the iPad, and then you want to do a popover, obviously there's no Shift key that you can just initiate when you're staring at a tablet. So you tap that little keyboard icon in the upper right corner, and then the little column of icons, those whichever one you tap on, those all represent the popovers. So it's basically a way of initiating the same shortcuts that would be initiated by holding down the Shift key on the computer keyboard and then holding down whatever letter that you would want. So like Shift B for bar, there's a little icon on the right side of the screen that will get you that same popover for adding and subtracting bars.
Okay. Yeah, so you could have it selected to not be the keyboard, but if you're attached to a keyboard, the keyboard shortcut would then just do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's just a handful of these. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I use the clef, the key signature, and the time signature, and the tempo popovers I use all the time for entering those exact things.
Yeah. I love with the with the beats per 70 chord notes, 70 equals a chord note or whatever. I love that you can tap out your beat per minute or whatever it is. That's super useful.
Yeah. It's just baked in with all of these great features. I mean, this is not even to mention the fact that if you are not attached to a keyboard, you have an on-screen piano that you can touch with your fingers.
Yeah. How have you found that? Has that been useful?
So people who tell me that they get a lot of use out of it are people who are working more with chords than I'm used to doing. So like if you want to just have like a triad entered on the screen, just holding like the notes C, E, and G on the on-screen piano keyboard at once, we'll get that. Whereas that's, a handful of other taps and clicks otherwise.
Gotcha. And something I'm curious about, I've tried to do this where I have like a cello who's holding like a G, and then I want that same cello player to be then doing chord notes above that. How do you do that in Dorico?
So I don't know if you would like have to write you basically use the voice feature in order to get that to appear. That's a good question.
The voice feature lets you have multiple voices within the same player line. Is that what it's for?
Yeah, I'm trying to think to myself how I would do that in another program. Like, what would I do? I would probably just use like basically just say, okay, like I would treat it the same way as if I were using one treble clef. Yeah, like if I were writing a flute part for two players using the the same row in the staff.
Yeah, because some apps have the concept of layers, and you have like layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. You can just have different layers of the same stave.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I'll have to do some research, see how that's done. Some less obvious toolbar icons. Are there any that you find helpful? I know there's like these scissors that like I'm not quite sure what all these things do because I don't end up using them, but some of them may be useful. Are there any of things in the toolbar that you do find useful that may not be super obvious when you open the app?
So for me, I do so much from the keyboard. So I, on the one hand, would say like I don't tap those a lot, but that doesn't mean I'm not using those features just through the mouse or the trackpad or through the computer keyboard. Yeah, there's lots of ways to do the same thing, and that's one of the kind of the cool things really about notation software is that there are so many different really intuitive and valid methods of note input. So like having a MIDI keyboard, a mouse, a trackpad, and a computer keyboard all at your disposal sort of in a row is great because whatever your hand is hovering over, when the note that you have in your brain comes to your brain, that's the thing that you're going to input the note in with if it's something that you've really practiced. So for me, I try to be pretty equally good at inputting notes through a piano or through a computer keyboard or a mouse. But I don't. It's clicking around in toolbars is not always the most appealing thing to me. It's probably something I should get better at, given that it is the primary note entry method of the iPad version.
Yeah.
I mean, the basic ones. So, there's like pitch before rhythm, which I know we've talked about a little bit before recording, which is where you determine the note on, the pitch of the note before the rhythm, and then you see it enter on the staff, and then you choose the duration of the note. So that toggle is on the left side.
Yeah, it's a very important toggle because I didn't know that toggle existed. I just did the preference pane of defaulting, and I couldn't figure it out. So yeah, that's a very important toggle.
I don't understand. Yeah, I don't understand why that's in the preferences and what the difference is between toggling it from the toolbar versus the preferences. I will say, by the way, speaking to the preferences, is that in Dorico, you have tons of options over how the notation and the layout of the score looks. And those preferences, if you've ever seen them before on the Mac or the Windows version, are so dense and so powerful and customizable that when you see them translated to the iPad, it's like kind of blows your mind for a second just to see like the level. Because it's not like, I think, Photoshop would be an example of a really, really powerful app that was recently brought to the iPad not that long ago. And I think that people were pretty disappointed at what it could and couldn't do at launch. And just to think about this company that has like a smaller team.
It's 5 developers or something like that?
Yeah, something like that. And like many less years of development. Just to think about the achievement of getting any one of these professional scoring apps on the iPad with nearly like even half the features that they've shipped with is astounding. So yeah, I don't know. It's cool. It's a fun thing to poke around with if you're opening even just the free version of Dorico for the first time.
Yeah, and the free version, I was using that for quite a while, and then it's like, I should pay for this, and I am glad I paid for it because I am getting a lot of utility out of some of those extra features that you get from the paid version. And the unlimited players is something I'm using with the flows, because if you have one project, I can now have any instrument I want and not be worried about hitting the threshold.
Right.
The drop-down menu that lets you transpose, and are there things in there that you use frequently?
So by drop-down menus, you're talking about the ones
the little
that
triple dot thing.
Yeah, so those are things that I use fairly often on the desktop version. I haven't done enough work with it on iPad yet that I can speak to them, but they more or less work the same way that they do on the desktop. So I do plan on doing more with those things in the near future. I mean, there's just like infinite things that I can and can't do. And then, of course, right next to that is the little eye icon, which can do some things like change from page view to gallery view, which is actually, I think, something that Sibelius does not have on its current iPad version. It's a way I really like to write, so I do appreciate.
Yeah, gallery view is what I like to work in.
Yeah, I like it a lot. And you can sort of choose some things about signposts and power numbers, and there's a bunch of like toggle on and off options in there. And then you've got some transposing options. Yeah, I mean, it's at this point, it's almost hard to think about what is and isn't worth covering about the Dorico app. I even wrote in my blog post when it shipped, like, it's hard to talk about Dorico for iPad without reviewing the desktop version, because it really is.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same app except for a couple little things that are missing.
Right, and that's not. I mean, I know I said earlier that the Pro version on desktop, that there is not a tier of the iPad version that meets that. But when I say that, I'm talking about like really specific features of the app. I'm not talking about the core experience of the app. Like the experience of like inputting notes, through the on-screen piano keyboard, or like through the computer keyboard, or like entering like setup mode, write mode, play mode. Like all of these things are, regardless of like every single possible tool and option available to the app, these core features are in even the free version. So
yeah, it's a desktop class app on iPad. It's one of the few, I'd say, that's like it's the desktop professional level software on your iPad.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with that statement a lot. It's impressive that it's happened in our corner of the world.
Yeah.
I feel really lucky that these two programs released so close to each other, it's
good for competition, because they'll be more encouraged to be better than the other one.
Yeah, I think that to some extent there will be some of that, and I think that competition is good. I mean, I'd like to see both of these programs do some things, add some things in the future. I think I spoke a little bit about what I'd like to see from each of them. But yeah, I think as like a 1.0, they definitely have taken some different approaches to design. And, those, whether or not those are for you, the user, are going to be somewhat personal. I mean, a good analogy and I'll only say this only because of the past week I've really been digging into the current darling of the Apple community, Obsidian.
Yep,
which is like an Electron app. So it has a whole lot of quirks that don't make it feel very native to any of the Apple platforms, but it feels very, very much true to itself and the same on all different devices. And, I think that there's something to be said for that, maybe being like a really good choice in the scoring and notation community. Just, having, especially when you're dealing with musicians who oftentimes don't want to learn something new on their iPad.
And there's also a way to make that eighth note extended into like a quarter note and a whole note.
Exactly.
Right.
So if you hold the shift key while holding the option key, and then you hit the right key, it'll basically extend the length of the note by that same value. So like if I have the eighth note selected in the grid, and then I hold shift option and then the right, it'll turn that eighth note into a quarter note. And then if I hit the right key again, it'll turn it into a dotted quarter note, and then a half note. And it basically just adds.
So shift option does that, and then just plain option moves it. Is that what the other way is?
That's right.
Okay, gotcha.
And if you just accidentally select the wrong, like sometimes I'll be typing some eighth notes and I'll need a quarter note, and I just like tap the wrong number and I get a like a 16th note instead maybe, and it's really easy once you input that rhythm, because I'm a rhythm before pitch user. So if I do get the wrong rhythm, all I have to do is hold the option key and then just hit the right arrow or the left arrow until I get the duration that I needed. Sorry, shift option. I'm mixing them up, but you know what I mean. Shift plus option, and then the right arrow will extend the length of the note. Sorry, one more. If you do the up and down arrow while holding option, I told you before that'll move the pitches up and down, but it does that diatonically. So whatever key area you've set your key signature to, if you hold shift, it'll move the note up and down chromatically, which is also really useful.
Oh, that's super useful. And what's the process for for changing like an F sharp to a G flat, is there a way to override what Dorico thinks is best?
Yes, there's a handful of ways. And that's the cool thing about Dorico is that without getting too far into the weeds, you can, of course, do infinite things in Engrave Mode. So you can make anything look like you want it to, regardless really of what the actual pitch is that you input in the write mode. But of course, you can also, you can click on the note and then you can like just, completely go through the process of re-entering. Like say you typed in an F sharp, well, you can like go to where that note is with your cursor and you can type, the flat symbol and then the letter G. And by saying type the flat symbol, what I really mean is just selecting it from the computer keyboard, which is, I believe, the plus or it's the minus button.
Okay.
Has whatever letter you type will become a flatted note. And so that's one way to do it. And then there's like a handful of, in the notation and layout and engraving settings, you can like tweak a lot of things that Dorico does with how it interprets things like enharmonics, things like the way that notes are beamed. Like, for example, if you want all of your eighth notes to be beamed, like every 4 notes has a beam at the top, you can select that. Or if you want it to like there's just all sorts of things you can do, because one of the things that Dorico was built from the ground up based on is this idea that the results that you get are going to be extremely legible without having to do a whole lot of tweaking, but then there's endless tweaking that you can do. So for whatever reason, like I think Dorico makes excellent choices about how it beams things, how it spaces things apart, how it makes things legible. But if you wanted to do something like take eighth notes in 6/8 time and have them beamed in pairs instead of like every 3, you can do that kind of stuff as well.
Okay.
It takes a little bit of time to kind of learn, because it's, in a sense, it's kind of like the notation and the layout and the engraving options are kind of like 3 different, and then of course there's the actual there's the preferences of the app itself, and then there's kind of like 4 different places. I don't know if anyone listening has ever used Pro Tools. There's like 3 or 4 different places that you kind of find all the settings. There's like a whole settings area of the app just for like ins and outs of the program. And Dorico's a little bit like that. Like I found that the layout notation, like all of those things that have the word options after them are ways that you can sort of customize the behavior and the look of things, and then the settings themselves offer you all sorts of more customizations. Personally, I kind of like to have one setting screen, but once you get acclimated to the idea that all of the stuff you want to control is in these like 3 or 4 areas of the app, then you're good to go.
Gotcha. And then for going over and adding like articulations, can you use the cursor, like the left and right arrow, to like going through note by note, and then is there a keyboard shortcut from there to just, this note I have selected, I'm gonna make it staccato? Is there like Shift A or something to add articulations, or what's the way to quickly go through note by note and kind of add those markings to it?
It's sort of it's a toggle, and I do tend to do things like slurs and ties. And maybe usually ties I do on my first round, since they're a little bit more associated with the duration of the notes. But things like slurs, accents, staccato, I do those from the keyboard. And if I think to do them first, you can type the keyboard shortcut for a staccato marking is the right bracket. And if you type it before you input the pitch, then it'll have that once the note displays on the screen. But what I sometimes do is what you're saying is I just kind of like, once I'm done, I'm writing the melody, I'll move through the notes with the right and left arrow keys, and then just any time the note that I want to have a staccato marking is selected, I'll hit the right bracket and it'll add it right on top.
Oh, nice. So you don't have to have that overlay thing that we talked about for dynamics for doing articulations, at least the common ones.
Yeah, so there's an area in the app that is sort of like a panel that slides out from the left, and it has a bunch of different note values, things like a half note, a quarter note, an eighth note. And underneath of that, there is an area for the natural sign, the flat sign, the sharp sign, a slur, marcato, tenuto, staccato, accent, and then, a couple of other articulations that are less common. And all of those have buttons on the computer keyboard that you can type either before inputting the note or after the fact once it's selected orange.
Okay. Very cool. And if I'm selecting like a bunch of notes all at once on, I think Mac, the cursor behaves kind of how you'd expect it to, where you're clicking and dragging to select a bunch of stuff. Do you know the translation for how that works on iPad? I think it's a bit different from what I've played around with.
Yeah, so on the Mac, I can click with the cursor in a white space. That is not a note that's been input or some kind of symbol. And I can drag to get, kind of like a selection square, so to speak. And then once I lift my finger off the mouse button, then everything I had selected will be orange. And there actually is something like that on the iPad. It's just that because the finger is going to, because tapping the finger with your screen sometimes is an active gesture, you have to hold your finger first, and then a little square will animate wherever your finger is. It even kind of has a little bouncing, wiggling kind of animation to it to let you know that it's happening. And then from there, you drag similarly to what you want, and then it'll be selected orange.
Okay, very cool. And something I noticed within Dorico, there's actually a commenting system, and I'm not sure what kind of creative uses you've found of this. Is this for you're sending a Dorico file to a student and marking up on, if they were in, say, a one-on-one student with practice, you could give them notes about things, or how do you find yourself using this?
I actually don't really do it. Option C will create a comment, and it just opens up a text box. I'm going to do it right now. And you can just kind of click comment. And what it does is it just sort of like puts almost like a little speech bubble above that area that was selected in the score. And then you can click on it to see it. It's an elegant solution because, I used to do a little bit more of this when I was using Sibelius. And those comments were very much in Sibelius. We're kind of imitating the visual look of like what you might see in Microsoft Word. And then Dorico is a little bit more discreet, kind of trying to get out of your way a little bit more when you're writing the score. And then, of course, you can double click on the graphic of the word bubble to see what the comment actually is. And then if you want, hold on, for whatever reason, it's grayed out, and I don't know why. You can filter all of your comments once created. And you can toggle them on and off as well. So you can basically just say in the view options on the Mac, it's from the menu bar. But it's just a toggle that you can toggle on and off.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm curious about the future of Dorico with being a performance tool. Now it's on the iPad, of like a conductor/composer beaming out parts to like every iPad in the room. And, you register, I'm the, trumpet one, and it just knows to go there. And even like some programs I know will sync up from a conductor and where they're at. It can get pretty deep with performing from an iPad and score syncing in kind of cool ways.
Yeah, I think StaffPad definitely has the most sort of like complete idea about how they want to handle that. Because, StaffPad has this like complimentary reader app where you can have a bunch of musicians put it on their music stand. And then someone who's actually looking at the score document in the actual like full StaffPad iPad app can kind of like beam, the individual parts to the different iPads who are in the room on the same network using this reader app. And what's cool is like a lot of the changes happen in real time. So like someone can say, hey, this note is like out of the range of my instrument, and the person who's directing the rehearsal or the person who's sitting at the iPad with StaffPad open to the document can basically just like make that edit directly onto the score and then beam it back out. So there's never any round tripping to an application like Fourscore, which is, for me anyway, is my sheet music reading, annotating, and sort of library management app of choice. And of course, Fourscore is more just like, it's so much more than this. So I feel like this is diminishes it to some extent. But I explain it to people who've never encountered it before as just kind of a glorified PDF reader with music specific features to it. So it is really designed to open and work with files that have been like completed and then exported to a file like PDF, where it's not, you're not intending to like be able to transpose or edit the notes or the rhythms or really do much with the layout of it once it's been saved. You're just kind of intending still to, once it gets into something like Fourscore, you can like draw on it, you can add metadata to it, you can organize it in a set list. But to my knowledge, StaffPad is one of these programs that has that sort of like integrated workflow between the editing tool and the reading tool.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I'm very curious to see how these other tools will evolve and if that will become a thing. I was just thinking the other day that it'd be really amazing if some MIDI keyboard people made a full-size keyboard, which they have these MIDI full-size keyboards, but if it had another component with like a number pad and some of the keyboard shortcuts kind of built into like above the keyboard area, so you could just have an iPad sitting on top of where the sheet music would be, and you can like connect over Bluetooth, and it might even have two Bluetooth connections to your iPad from that one device of like, here's the QWERTY/number pad connection, and here's the MIDI connection, and you have this like kind of high-end piano that can be used as like a kind of composing tool right there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Actually, real quick, before you move on to something else, a keyboard shortcut I told you earlier in the conversation, I remembered it. I'm in my settings right now, and It's the. I just wanted to say the actual name of this feature is the one I was talking about earlier, where I have like a flute part at the top of a score, and then like an oboe part below it, and then like a saxophone below that. And I want to copy. So the actual option for that in Dorico is called move to staff above or below, and then there's actually also an option to copy to staff above or below. So if you want to take something and then move it to the staff below it, it's option M. And then if you, I actually added a custom keyboard to do the other option, which is actually to copy it, not to move it. So that's, for me, I hold the command key and the option key, another M, and that will, take the flute part and bounce it down to the oboe.
Do you do any other custom keyboard shortcuts within Dorico, or is that kind of your one that you kind of customize for your app?
I wait for Dorico. I wait for my process to inform me what I'm doing a lot of that's getting in my way. I don't try to go out of my way. So like sometimes certain kinds of bar lines, like repeat signs, I like to have shortcuts for, like where I click a bar line and then I have a little one or two keystroke kind of command that adds a particular kind of bar line or repeat. But you can also easily do those things through one of the popover menus as well. So all the popovers have these like things that handle your first and your second endings. And I can even send you a link to. There's a great document online that Dorico manages that is just it's a huge PDF of all of the possible text-based commands you can enter into popovers and what musical notation they result in.
Gotcha. Yeah, very cool. And then something I've been running into, especially with like cello and some of the other instruments I'm writing for, is I'm inputting notes that have a lot of ledger lines, either above or below the staff. And what's kind of the best practice here of inputting these notes? Should I be having all these ledger lines and then correcting within the kind of engraving mode to make them more readable for the player, or should I be putting them lower and then adding like the 8VA sign to like fix that at the time, or what do you do for this? How do you handle this in Dorico?
I think like if you want to know specifically how you do a particular feature, it's going to vary on your method. But I think more broadly, someone would just want to ask like, what is the musical context and the reason why you would want to do that in the first place? So is it like I guess using
for readability mainly, like so the player's not looking at all these 1,000 ledger lines.
Right. I mean, yeah, I would just defer to, and it's been like a hot minute since I've been in an orchestral arranging class.
Yeah.
So what cellists like specifically,
right,
is maybe not like something I'm prepared to just spit out of my mouth. But basically, I would look to the conventions of what does a performer want to read in the context that you're composing or arranging for, and then I would do that. So I mean, most cellists I know above a certain amount of ledger lines, they want to see the clef change so that they're reading within a comfortable zone at all times. And cellists in particular are very, very comfortable reading in the treble clef, for example.
Yeah.
So if things go like kind of high up there, that's something that I would do a clef change in that case.
Gotcha. And bassoon can go the tenor clef on certain occasions.
Yeah, that's what I would do. As far as adding like an octave marking, that would be certainly another option. And those are all popover commands as well. So one of the things I love is just how many things you can do without taking your fingers off of the computer keyboard.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I think you can see why this is, like, as far as iPad releases are concerned, why this is resonating with me is because I have found that the computer keyboard is just such a fast way to input notes if you take the time to learn what to do. And so because these keyboard shortcuts and even the custom keyboard commands all translate to the Dorico iPad version, all I have to do is just recall the same ones I know. I don't know them all off the top of my head. But the ones that I do know are the same on all platforms.
Yeah, and the brilliant thing, it's like, doesn't matter that's not a Mac. It's basically the same app, and you have the same interfaces with the keyboard, and you only have benefits of adding the touchscreen for when you do want to touch the screen and do stuff that way as well.
Clefs and octave lines, by the way, I'm looking in the document now. Those are all under that's like its own popover menu. So if you hold the shift key and then press the letter C, which is, in Dorico terms means, it stands for the word clef, then you have a whole lot of things you can type. So if you type in the letter G, the word treble, that'll add a treble clef to your score.
Oh, nice.
The letter F or the word bass will add a bass clef. Tenor clef is the letters CT, or you can just type the word tenor.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you can see, like, some of these have a little bit of a syntax that you got to remember, but a lot of them also just use, like, natural language. So, like, typing the word treble, like, treble is what you want, right? You want the treble clef. So remembering to type in the word treble isn't too hard. For me, I sometimes get a little bit confused about which popover I want, but that just could be my own inexperience.
Yeah, the more you use it, the more you'll kind of learn what popover to use.
Right, and there are some conflicting commands, and that's the reason why there are as many popovers as there are. Like, there are certain words that if you type them into one popover, they do one thing, and then they do another thing if typed into another popover. So I totally get why they're segmented the way that they are. So octave below is treble 8BA, or you could type G 8D.
Okay.
That's after hitting Shift
Right.
C. Yeah, I mean, and there's just like so many things. Like an unpitched percussion clef would be PERC for percussion. 4-string tab 4. Invisible clef, you just type in the word invisible. Tons of things you can do in there. There's a whole chord symbol popover, which is Shift Q, which I guess they didn't have. C was used for clef, so they used Q for chord. That's a pretty good one. Like, you can type in like the inversion, the quality, the interval, or alterations. That's not to mention that there's also an interval popover, which is Shift I, which then you can type in. Like if you type in Shift I and then in the little, popover menu, you type in the number 3, it'll add a third on top of whatever notes you had selected before you initiated the popover.
Which, that's been super fun to use as I've been writing some piano stuff. That's been just pretty nice to have in there.
Another good one is if you type in a lowercase m for minor before the 3, then every interval will be exactly a minor third above the selected pitches.
Oh, nice.
Regardless of key signature. And then, of course, a capital M for major will do the same thing, but add major thirds above all of the selected pitches.
Oh, that's really cool. If you're writing some horror music, you can, I imagine A4 would work for augmented fourth, maybe?
Let's see. I'm looking in the settings now. So, actually, I can just, aug. Well, okay, so then you've got, sorry, I'm looking still on the chord symbol.
Yeah.
Related popover, which you can make a chord augmented by typing AUG for augmented, or the plus symbol.
Yeah.
Well, you can. Okay, so one other thing that I commonly do is like when I have the interval popover, like if you type 3, as I said, it'll add a third to every selected note, but you can type in the comma, a comma followed by other intervals and get a bunch in a row. So like if I have 3, 5, we'll turn every selected note into a, like a little triad.
Yeah.
With a third and a fifth stacked on top of it.
Okay. Yeah. So you can kind of build out chords in that way versus having to enter the notes. You can basically build out your melody and then from there add the intervals on top of that after you figure out what your main melody is going to be.
Yeah. What was the one you asked about a second ago?
Augmented fourth. So could you have like a C and F sharp as an example with the interval by putting like maybe A4.
Yeah, let's just find out. So I'm going to select here. I go to the interval popover. Let me do it to a single pitch and be less confused.
Yeah.
Like what just happened on my screen. Okay, so I've got a C selected. Yeah, AUG4 adds an augmented fourth
AUG4
above the selected note.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. That's the very famous you'll hear it in a lot of movies, augmented fourths. It's like a war cry, And then something I've been curious about. So I'm a wind player. I don't write much percussion because it kind of confuses me a bit. The virtual instruments, is that making the process of writing percussion easier for you, having that as an input method versus kind of the virtual pianos and things that aren't exactly percussion?
So I've already got a couple of ways around this. The first thing I'll say is that I kind of am comfortable with the computer keyboard, and Dorico actually handles computer keyboard. Actually, every method of percussion note input is, I think, handled in a superior way by Dorico. A lot of times I type in the right keyboard, commands for the notes, on, whatever line or space on the staff I'm trying to input. Mm-hmm. Like say, like a hi-hat will be like, like an X symbol with, a stem facing upward, like usually like right above the staff or like on the top line of the staff. Kind of, there's a lot. One of the problems, of course, is how many inconsistencies there are with drum set notation.
Yeah. So with percussion, let me see if I'm explaining this right. So like at the beginning of the part, it'll like have the list of instruments, and each line on the staff will pertain to a different instrument. So if you're playing like 3 instruments, you'll have each line as a separate instrument if it's unpitched.
Right. So exactly. So like, for example, if I type in like, even though a drum set part, for example, would use the percussion clef, you would still type in pitches similar to a treble clef to get the symbol on the exact line or space you would want. So like if I type the letter G, I'm going to get an X note head that appears where a G would appear above the staff of the treble clef, and then it's going to have a stem facing up. So basically, that's what's going to get my hi-hat. I'm mentioning drum set notation specifically because it's usually one of the most cumbersome percussion instruments to input in a notation editor, and I think it's handled super well by Dorico. It's actually one of the things that makes it great is because you moving the arrow keys left and right can move you along a grid that you designate, so you can have it move either an 8th note or a 16th note. This makes it a little bit more precise to see, because sometimes drums are super commonly perceived as in maybe someone is used to coming from a DAW where they have a MIDI editor, or they're used to conceiving of rhythm in some other kind of way other than traditional notation. This works super well for those kinds of users as well, because you're just moving along a grid before you actually input the note. But yeah, then when you input the note, it's just using the same letters as the treble clef staff. So if I use a C, for example, that's going to be the third space on the staff, which is where the snare drum would go. And what's great is that, let's just say do a basic beat, like some kind of rock drum set beat. If I input 8th notes on the hi-hat on the, right above the staff, and then I go back and I input the snare drums on beat 2 and beat 4, Dorico does a really great job of getting the default look of that to look the same way I would want to read it as a drum set player. Whereas I've seen a lot of really, really, really funky stuff in other score editors. And to come back to your question of input, the iPad version of the app introduces, in addition to the keyboard and the keyboard and the fretboard methods of touch input that I mentioned before, they also add a drum pad input method where basically you just get a grid of squares that you can sort of you can drag and drop them around in the order that you want. You can, have basically, it's similar to if you have a MIDI keyboard that has a grid of rubber squares that you can hit to trigger the drum instruments. It's just a little bit more of a natural way of playing a MIDI drum set.
Yeah, I would love if they took it further, if you had a timpani, if it just the drum thing would turn into a virtual timpani. I'm not sure if it does that. I haven't played around with that, and making it more custom to whatever percussion that is, you're inputting at that time.
I don't think any plugin that I have ever seen that is, just to use timpani as an example, actually looks like timpani and lets you interact with it in the same way. I'm thinking of GarageBand plugins, Logic plugins, Superior Drummer plugins, Contact plugins that I have on the Mac, and none of them I think that I'm aware of anyway.
Is there a reason for that? Is it just doesn't make sense to do that?
I mean, there's just really, I guess the only way it would really work is just if you're trying to, there's no kind of responsiveness to a touch screen in particular that's going to get you better results from touching something that looks like timpani versus a square on the screen. So, just 4 squares that move from left to right is how I would organize that. I don't know.
Do you get a pick which pitch that square represents for the timpani when you can? Is there a configuration aspect of this?
Let's find out. So I'm going to go to, and I'll walk you through this because the keyboard shortcuts are super fast even on iPad. So Command 1 goes to setup mode, which is where I can add players and instruments. Shift P adds a new player to the score, and then I can just type in the word timpani to find it amongst all the instrument options, and then I'm going to add it to my score. Command 2 goes back into write mode, and then I'm going to go ahead and go to my the staff where the timpani appears, and then hit enter to input notes, and then I'm going to select at the bottom of the screen the drum pad option, which is sort of towards the lower left. All right, so drum pads only work with unpitched percussion, it's telling me. So timpani,
okay. So you just use a piano keyboard probably, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that would work for me pretty well, too. Of course, being someone with lots of professional timpani training, I know that I'm not going to just play some wacky bass line and expect someone reading it to...
Right, you're not going to have 12 notes on the You're not going to be... No timpanists will have 12 timpanis around them. Well... Unless it's some crazy movie score and they budget that or something. And in this virtual instruments area, there's this properties window that has a lot of different little settings. And I haven't really figured out what this is exactly for.
Yes, and I'm not 100% sure. I do believe the technical term they call that window has the word properties in it. It's basically some general score properties that control the score. And of course, in those many, many different notation and layout options, you can designate certain kinds of preferences to apply to every score you ever open in Dorico. But then you've got some per score based stuff that appears there at the bottom. And so that's just going to be things like notes, kind of notes in rest position, how they are impacted. One of the things I commonly do down there is at least before I knew how to change the option permanently, is the default in Dorico is to, when you add a rehearsal marking, is to give it a letter. And I more commonly want it to just show the number of the measure the student is on, because that's for a lot of reasons. I think that's easiest to read, but I also, a lot of the band scores that my middle school students are playing are that way.
Yeah.
So I generally would change that setting down there on the properties for what the rehearsal markings look like, but then I learned that you can actually just permanently change them,
Gotcha.
in the whole score without tweaking that.
One thing I like to do is obviously play back what I'm writing. I'm kind of the guy that doesn't want to see the fancy Cubasis kind of look to it. I know some people like that, and some people find it handy, but I find it kind of difficult to actually get back to a certain measure in my music to hit play when I'm in write. Is there a simple way to do that, or am I stuck going to play mode, then clicking back to write mode to look at the notation?
So yeah, this is an area of frustration for me, is that the transport which is in the upper right corner, doesn't have a lot of ways to choose where you start. So like one thing you can do is if I hit play, for example, a couple of measures might play, and then if I hit stop, let's just say around like measure 3, I can hit the what is called the rewind button, or rewind to beginning, which is to the left of the play button. And then that will go back to the beginning, but there are ways to move. You know what? This is probably in the keyboard shortcuts. Let's just search for the word rewind. So in the play options, so there's only one type of rewind that's keyboard shortcut customizable, and the default is F7 or number and then minus key. And that is not the same as what happens when you hover over the rewind to beginning a flow button, which is to the left of the play button. That's number plus the plus button, which will go back to the beginning. So how you go to a particular measure, spacebar to start and stop playback. Playback will start from the current position of the playhead. Shift plus space to play from the previous start position. Shift Alt space will start playback from the beginning of the flow. Make a selection and then press P to start playback just from that rhythmic position. Make a selection on more than one staff and press P to play just the ones that are selected. And then press Alt plus P to move the playhead to the current selection.
That's what we're looking for, right? Alt plus P?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're saying that you would want to say, okay, I want to start playback from measure 3. You stick, you take the mouse and you click, on the first note of measure 3. Yeah, so it looks like that would be the one you would want, is Alt plus P. In fact, let's just see if that works.
Yeah, because constantly I'd be, let's go in the play mode, and that has a very nice draggable cursor of where I can start playing, and I'd be going back and forth between write and play to kind of get where I need to be.
Now, I'm wondering if, hold on, I'm in write mode, because the key editor is the new feature that shows the piano roll underneath the notation. And you can actually select playback from the key editor just by basically clicking.
Oh, so on iPad it might be simple. It's just to have that down below as like a virtual instrument. Because, most of the time I just have that window down below just hidden away to have more score on the screen. But that would be a way about it as well.
And being someone who doesn't interact with this software through touch as much as I think the Dorico team designed the app to be used, I anticipate that I will use this key editor more often by far than I will use any of like the on-screen piano or the on-screen fretboard or the drum pads, any of these other things that can appear in that bottom part of the screen.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, all the touch optimizations that these developers do, which makes sense because this is an iPad and you should be able to use this with just in tablet mode. But I think, I'll be using this mainly as you would on the Mac with the keyboards and MIDI keyboards and trackpads and not touching the screen so much.
Right.
And anything else about write mode itself, like the way you get stuff into this app and manipulate the app within write mode before we move on to Engrave Mode?
Yeah, for me, again, it's just like duration and pitch comes first. I do a sweep through. Like, let's just say, like one common thing that I'll do in Dorico is like take a jazz band piece that my jazz band is playing, but we've got some horns and some tubas and some flutes in our jazz band, and I don't want to turn them away from the opportunity of playing jazz. But it's only more recently that young jazz literature is including all of these different band instruments. So for some of my older music, what I'll have to do is often recreate one of the parts from the score and then, transpose it so that it's a flute part. So sometimes let's just say I want the first alto saxophone part to be doubled in the flute, or at least I want that to be the basis of where I start for my flute arrangement. I'll re-input the notes. And it's typically, like I said before, I'll do the pitch and the rhythm, and then I'll come back and do a sweep of the articulation and the slurs. Then what I'll typically do is come back and add the dynamics, and then the first and the second endings, and then to be honest with you, the defaults are so good for most of my use cases that I don't often go into Engrave Mode. But Engrave Mode is definitely a place where you can do a whole lot of things. The primary idea that I think someone would want to get comfortable with who wants to start doing some customization is the idea of frames. And there's a whole lot you can do with this. So this is where the iPad and the Mac Windows versions start to kind of like diverge a little bit from one another, because you do have some of the Engrave features on the iPad, even though the highest paid tier of the iPad version is comparable to a Mac Windows version that does not have Engrave Mode at all on the desktop.
Interesting. Yeah. And I have no idea what the frame mode is. I understand music systems and like doing like basically if you're talking about a written word like line breaks almost, right? But frames, what's Dorico consider a frame, and what does Engrave Mode enable you to do there?
Yeah, so I'm just going to literally read you their definition because I think it's better and more concise than I would explain it. So frames allow you to position your music, additional text, and graphics anywhere inside the margins of the page. Frames are rectangular boxes that can be positioned inside the page margins that have been defined for a layout. In Engrave Mode, you can see and adjust the frames according to your needs. In Dorico Pro, there are a few types of frames. The first one is musical frames that show the music of the selected players and flows. You can also do one that's a text frame, which allows you to enter text and text tokens. And then the third is a graphic frame that allows you to load an image or an illustration into various formats. So let's say you want to stick a graphic on your score, something that's very non-traditional notation. Let's just say you want to have, you're producing something for like a young group and you want to have a cute picture, like the short piano solo for a beginning pianist, and it's called like A Day in the Snow, and you want to have like a cartoon image of like some kids playing in the snow and in the background of where the title appears. You would take some sort of graphic file with that image that's living on your computer, and then you could define basically a square box in Engrave Mode that you would insert that image to, and then you would be able to resize and drag around that box, and then that image would not be something that, like when you're in write mode, clicking it, if you're trying to click like into the title to change the title, you wouldn't be able to accidentally click into that image by mistake or move it or something, because that frame is like only something that can be edited or worked with in Engrave Mode.
Gotcha. Yeah. And something I was just thinking about, back to write mode for a second, is it possible to have, so say you're doing some kind of abstract music, you have one player 5/4 and another player, say they're in 4/4. Is that possible to have simultaneous different time signatures across different instruments?
Yes, but I need to look it up.
Okay.
To tell you how to do it. Yeah. That might be an Engrave Mode thing. One of the things that's interesting about Dorico is that it actually, the desktop version anyway, does not default to a time signature. So you're just sort of like freely writing.
Interesting.
With duration and pitch. Yeah. And I actually wonder if they're going to change that in the next version of Dorico, because the iPad version has kind of like a little, when you create a new score, it has a little screen that pops up that asks you some of those things that maybe if you've used Finale or Sibelius.
Yeah, it forced me to add, I think, a time signature to add more measures to my score on the iPad.
Yeah, and if you're someone who's coming from Sibelius, you might be used to this idea of like starting a score is going to ask you some of that basic information before you even see the document. And I wonder if, I didn't ask Daniel when he was on my show about that, but I would imagine that part of that is to just simplify the experience for new users to the program, because I do expect that a lot of people will come to Dorico for iPad who are not Dorico or even not even using like any of the major professional notation apps on desktop.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that'll come to the Mac. I mean, to be totally honest, like there's a lot of things about Dorico that I respect, because they very carefully considered every single one of these detailed options, which is what I respect so much about them. That plus, of course, their transparency as developers. They really keep their user base aware of what the things are that they're planning, unless, of course, they're trying to surprise the community.
Yeah.
Something like this iPad app, for example. But yeah, so one of the things that I think, that even though it's something I respect about the Dorico design that just does not work for me personally, is this idea that there's really, really common musical information that I need as a middle school teacher that I have to add every single time because some of those options for creating the document aren't there. So like, let's be real. Like I do a lot of 4/4 time in middle school.
Sure.
So,
yeah. That's
like,
that's what you, probably C
but
major
it's not
common.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff. And so more, to being able to do more with custom templates is of course another thing I would love to see from the program down the road. Just being able to have some things like one of the things I do most commonly, really like more than anything else, is I just need to make a 4/16 measure example of something that's going to be embedded maybe in a slide of a keynote presentation to my class or maybe in a worksheet. But I'm building the worksheet in a different program, like a design or a word processing program, and I just need to like take a little musical excerpt and type it into Dorico, get it looking nice, but then basically take it out of there and put it into something else. And so commonly I'm in 4/4 time in C major, in treble clef, and there's still a few more clicks and taps to get a score set up that way than I would like there to be. I realize I'm a little bit of an edge case, but music educators are certainly a big target audience of this kind of software. So we'll see. I mean, I don't remember if it made it onto the air of my interview with Daniel Spreadberry, but of course I asked him, amongst all of the native iPad features I would love to see come to Dorico, I asked him about Siri shortcuts because I'm a big shortcuts user.
Yeah, I was just about to ask about that. With Sibelius is more iPad native, so I'm curious what kind of shortcuts you could think up for these kind of apps.
It's funny you say that. So like, for me, it would be something really, really simple and basic, like create a new score in 4/4 time in C major with treble clef staff, or maybe like having some sort of template. Like here's a string quartet template, and rather than going through the options in the hub to set up a new score, maybe I just want to tap one button in Siri shortcuts and then have Dorico automatically open a new copy of a score with that set of instruments in that key, in that time signature. That would be the kind of document-based stuff that would help my flow. But there's, of course, in the desktop version of Dorico, there's these like really powerful macros you can automate. And I've actually been thinking of getting more into this because, to come back to adding intervals, that's something that in Sibelius, I actually really appreciate you being able to just highlight some notes and then type the number 3 without needing to even use a popover first. So like that same action of taking, let's just say, an E on the staff and then hitting Shift I for the interval popover and then the number 3 and then enter. In Sibelius, you just highlight the note and hit the number 3, and that's it. I think on the iPad version, it's Shift 3 because the iPad version of Sibelius repurposes the number keys to change the note duration since there's no keypad as there is expected to be in the desktop version.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So one of the things I've been thinking of toying with, and I'll have to get back to you after the recording to let you know how it goes, is just to basically create a little macro in Dorico to see if I can get the action of holding Shift I, typing in the number 3, and then hitting enter, basically just getting that down to one key. And I think it would probably be possible, but unfortunately, macros do not translate to the iPad version, at least not yet.
Yeah. Something with Engrave Mode I'd love if Dorico could eventually do is for more abstract music is be able to manipulate the thickness of the staves, so you could like gradually have the stave lines go from thin to thick. And I did this in college with I had a 5-tipped nib dipping pen, and I would use that to indicate the tempo almost, where I don't have tempo markings, but the line gets thicker, it gets slower for the music and thinner as it gets faster, and that was like kind of an abstract way to convey that stuff. I don't know if they'd ever branch into kind of weirder stuff like that for Engrave Mode, but I don't know, just came to mind.
I don't know about having that. I mean, I think you can customize that kind of thing in Engrave Mode, but to have it gradually get thicker in a way that was almost... Because what you're describing is you need to have almost like an artistic level of control over what that looks like. And I almost wonder if that would just be best suited to a pen.
Right. Yes.
But Dorico was built from the ground up to be ultimately more flexible, to not be constrained by some of these conventions of more traditional musical styles. And that's precisely one of the reasons why they don't actually give you a key signature or a time signature when you boot it up, is they just want you to be kind of freely flowing with your musical thought and then not restricted by some of those conventions.
Right, yeah. Dorico supporting a third-party audio unit, virtual instruments and effects. So this is a feature that you get with that paid version of Dorico, and I know some other apps kind of use this. I'm not sure if you have a good way of explaining what kind of virtual instruments you can get into Dorico, how this enhances playback. Like, are we able to have some pretty high-end performances because of this, or what kind of capabilities does this open up?
I think the sky is the limit within the plugins and sample libraries that are available to the platform. So let's take, for example, something like Dorico on the Mac. The Mac version, you're going to be able to take any instrument in your score, and you're going to be able to use any kind of software plugin, like any kind of VST or audio unit plugin that you would use in a digital audio workstation. So, for example, I have a plugin suite made by Native Instruments, and they have this huge bundle of software instrument plugins that you can buy from them. And I forget which version, maybe like 10 or 11 I have, and it's called, what do they call it? Complete. Native Instruments Complete is what it's called. And one of the things that comes with this package is a sampler called Contact, which basically you can load libraries of instrument samples into and then have them become the sounds that your MIDI input device plays. So, for example, I can load up a sample of some orchestral strings, or maybe of a small string quartet, or maybe some like cinematic kind of tribal drums to, if I want to go full on Hans Zimmer with what I'm doing. And then I can basically plug those into different tracks of my project and then use my piano keyboard to input notes that sound like whatever that sample produces. A lot of these third-party plugins don't, what I should say, I guess, is that there's an extremely rich ecosystem of them for desktop computing platforms that does not exist on iOS. And I don't know how deep in the weeds you want to get about why this is, but for lots of developmental reasons, we don't have things like, like the Contact sampler that I was just talking about. Like, there's just nothing like that on the iPad. Obviously, this comes back to this idea of like, when you have something like Dorico, which is so much a similar experience on iPad to the Mac, then it all of a sudden becomes really frustrating if you are the kind of user who likes to customize the sounds of your instruments. Well, you go to play mode, and now if you are someone who owns a really, really expensive sample library of, say, like the Vienna, they do their whole like symphonic strings. I forget exactly the name of it, but they have like professional orchestral string samples that percussion samples that just sound as realistic as you're going to be able to get a sample to sound on your computer. And if you've paid for this software, which is thousands and thousands of dollars, and for all of these different libraries that contain gigabytes, terabytes even, of small little samples of what instruments sound like, on a Mac or a Windows device, you can plug in your favorite flute sound straight into the flute channel of Dorico in play mode, and you can get that sound. Whereas on the iPad version, you can still do that, but there's a different plug-in protocol on iOS, and it's called Audio Units, which has more in common. I learned later, after kind of experimenting with them, that it has more in common with the version of Audio Units on the Mac than I had originally thought. Like, it's not very difficult for a developer to make something that use an audio unit plugin that would run on iOS and the Mac. But the fact of the matter is that so much of this software was developed years and years and years before the iPad was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. So you have all of this old code, all of this. Would I like to believe that someone like Native Instruments is one day going to be able to make an iOS version of all of their software? Yes. Is that coming anytime soon? I don't think so.
Yeah, you do have the storage capabilities now with like 2 terabyte iPads, but the demand has to be there for them to see a market for it, right?
And then you've got stuff like there's a program called Note Performer, which is actually written it's designed to be used with notation software on desktop. So what it does is, in Dorico, if you're on the desktop version and you go into play mode, you can actually they have this sort of default instrument library that is what the sounds are by default. But if you actually click on it, you get a little drop down menu where you can choose any one of the available software instrument plugins that is on your Mac, or you can use Note Performer. And if I do that, then basically what Note Performer does is it just already is aware, like, that a flute is a flute, that a crash cymbal is a crash cymbal. So I don't have to go, like, if I wanted to use samples in Native Instruments, I would have to go to each instrument of my score and then tell it which plugin to use. And of course, if I'm using something like Contact, then Contact has to be running a flute sampler inside of it, an oboe sampler inside of it, a violin sampler inside of it, a pizzicato sampler, all of these different samplers. And I have to basically manually link each channel of Contact up to the correct instrument in play mode, whereas Note Performer, you just choose it from play mode, and then it just knows, okay, now we're going to link your flute in Dorico up to our flute sound. We're going to link your oboe up to our oboe sound. We're going to link your timpani up to our timpani sound. And then it just, makes your orchestra sound a whole lot better. And there's nothing like that on iOS either.
Right.
So while there are a lot of audio units, things that can be plugged into the iPad version of Dorico, it is, I don't know, it's something I don't see myself getting into too much because first of all, I've paid for this stuff on the Mac, and I don't want to pay for different software that does the same thing on iPad. Not to mention that there is not a whole lot of this stuff. There's a lot of it. It's just that like how much of it is extremely good and worth your money that's a different question.
Yeah, the market, I think, as I spoke with someone earlier on the podcast, is really strong for synthesizers. So if you're writing electronic music and writing a part for a synthesizer, you could make that sound pretty great, I think, on iPad, because there is, I think, a pretty healthy market for that as one vertical.
Yeah, Korg has a lot of stuff that's on the App Store, and their apps go on sale from time to time, and they'll heavily discount really, really crazy synthesizers. Things that work actually really well on the iPad, because like if you can think of a modular synth, all the different kinds of knobs you would need to manipulate the sound. All of that just becomes, these knobs can just be directly manipulated with touch.
Yeah.
And I'd say like the easiest way for someone to experiment with audio units is to go into the GarageBand app on iOS and then create a new track. And then I forget, they keep changing the name of it. I forget what it's called now, but it used to be called Audio Units. And what it's going to do is basically create a new track, which links out to one of these third-party apps. The app, of course, has to be designed to work as a plugin. And then once you select it, then the iPad sort of bounces you into that app. But if you go back to GarageBand, you'll see that a track has been created, which is named after whatever this third-party app is. Now, you don't have as much control over multitasking with Windows as you do on a Mac. So, like, you're kind of awkwardly, like, hitting the record button in GarageBand and then, like, sort of, like, swiping to the other app, hopefully in time to start inputting notes. And it's, in many cases, the ones that I've used are audio, so you have to be super precise unless you've got a MIDI controller plugged in. I don't know. It's for the same reason that I like to keep a lot of my other non-music software similar between the Mac and the iPad, just so that I have the same experience, the same data, the same financial resource has been pumped into the same experiences on all devices. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me to use this in the iPad version of Dorico.
Right. And the built-in libraries are pretty decent.
For what I need, sure.
Yeah.
I absolutely think they're good enough. And, there are some people who are trying to do a lot here. Like, we've talked a number of times about StaffPad. StaffPad is, I think, trying to, if I could describe their experience outside of this whole, like, other people in the room having the reader app and sort of, like, pushing the score to those musicians, I would say, like, the two major defining features of StaffPad are that they're trying to really revolutionize the input and the output methods of score software. You've got, like, Apple Pencil only input. I know they're working on, as was announced at WWDC last spring, they were in the keynote talking about a forthcoming feature where you'll be able to actually just play a real instrument from the external world into StaffPad, into the microphone of the computer, and have that generate notation. So, like, not even a MIDI controller that's sending a signal, but actually just play a real piano into the microphone and have StaffPad in real time write out the notes.
Yeah, which Finale's done that for years, but it was never successful enough for me to rely on that. But if they can make that great, that could be cool.
I think so, too. It's similar to the handwriting, as we'll just have to see how it is in execution. Okay, they changed in GarageBand, by the way, follow up here. They call it now external. It's no longer called, so it's an external track, but then there's the audio unit extensions, and then there's inter-app audio. And I don't know that you want to necessarily get into the minor differences between what those two things are. But basically, this is how you would bounce out to a third-party app. Any app that uses the audio unit protocol, it should be able to work with Dorico on iPad. But again, it's the fact that it's not going to be your same stuff. Like StaffPad, just to come back to them, like their other way that I think that they're really challenging the market for this kind of software on the iPad is that they have these really awesome sample libraries that are baked into the app as in-app purchases.
Yeah.
Now, this is super frustrating because I could buy a sample library made by Spitfire, who makes exceptionally awesome instrument samples, but then I can't use those with anything other than StaffPad, unlike, let's say, the desktop version, whereas if I buy that sample library, I can use that in Dorico, Ableton Live, Logic Pro, GarageBand, anything that's going to work with software plugins. So
yeah, I think StaffEd prices it lower because of that fact, right?
yes, but it's still, for me, not something that I think I'm going to invest in.
Yeah, I get that. I'd love if there would be like an iPad app so I could create my own audio unit libraries to pump in the Dorico, like myself playing saxophone and having that'd be cool as a concept.
That's like some next level tech you're talking about there.
Yeah, like there's font creators on iPad where you write out the different, here's capital A, here's lowercase a, but I don't know what is involved in creating sound libraries. I imagine it's a lot because you have to play all the different dynamics, all the different articulations. I imagine a very time-intensive process to get that right.
Yeah, I mean, like stuff like the Spitfire and like I was mentioning the Vienna sample libraries from earlier, the way that they do this is they take a violin and they say, okay, we're going to play the note G now, and we're going to record you playing G with these 8 different articulations at these 12 or more different dynamic levels, in these different styles with the bow placed on these different parts of the string, and then you're going to do that for every single note that the instrument can produce.
As a musician, that must be one of the most mind-numbing processes in the world to do.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never been there. I've never done it. So it's got to be interesting for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's for this reason that this stuff costs thousands of dollars to purchase, and why it's all the more frustrating that you can't use it on all of your devices, especially when the notation software itself is so powerful on iOS.
Yeah.
I've got to believe that Logic, if it ever comes to the iPad, will have some sort of plug-in story to come with it, because that's got to be one of the things that's held them up, is thinking about, that's a core part of the desktop experience of using a digital audio workstation, right?
Right.
I'm living in dreamland here, but it's like, imagine Logic announced on stage and like, hey, we've partnered with Waves and Native Instruments and a lot of these people who make, not only sample libraries, but things like, reverb plugins and equalizers. And, we've got these 3 partners that are going to bring some version of their plugin to iOS, and what if your license from the Mac even works for iOS? This is like my pie in the sky dream. I think one day we'll have to, one day this will have to be reckoned with, but I don't know that it's happening anytime soon.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking, they do sell like MIDI saxophones. They're not cheap. They're probably like $1,000 or so. That'd be kind of an interesting input thing to have with Dorico. I'm sure that would probably work since it's MIDI and MIDI is MIDI. So that'd be cool.
MIDI is MIDI, yeah. So, I mean, you can certainly use something like that to, if you're going to feel like you're going to be more comfortable rhythmically, getting that into the system, that's absolutely the way to go. For me, it's piano.
Yeah.
I do have an Ableton Push, which can be used, an Ableton Push is a grid of rubber squares that kind of adapt to which you need them to be. Now, of course, it's optimized for Ableton Live because you can control almost every feature of Ableton from this grid of squares. But it can also be used as a MIDI input device for other devices. And then to the left of my Ableton Push, I have a Roland Octopad, which is 8 drum triggers. And then it's got its own internal library where I can use it as an audio, I can basically just use it as an audio track and record myself playing the audio samples from within the device, or the pads can be used to trigger another software plugin. And another great example of one of these is called Superior Drummer, which is a drum set. It's like a suite of drum set, very, very realistic drum set samples that I can plug into a Logic project or an Ableton project, and then I can play drum set parts on the Octopad and then sample, like some of them, I mean, they even take famous drummers and their drum sets into the studio and record specifically them with their sound, so I can sound like this person or like this person, or I can sound like this person, but if their snare drum is just a little tighter than the way that they tuned it on that famous record, or with this crash cymbal from this kind of drum set and this snare drum from this kind of drum set, and instead of a kick drum, give me a cowbell. You can kind of go wild with it. And that's just something that does not exist on iPad.
Yeah. So anything else on play mode? I know we touched on it much earlier in this conversation about it being more than just play mode, but tweaking a virtual performance and even tweaking the notation if you want it to.
Yeah, I think that's more than enough on that subject for someone to get started.
Yeah. And then the desktop app has a special printing mode, which isn't on iPad, but there are some different export options on iPad, including the ability to print. Any kind of notes on these?
Well, I'll just speak to the iPad version in that I think, for me, I'm not the kind of user who needs to produce these beautiful scores. I'm not someone who is like taking a world premiere of a musical theater production and then typing it into Dorico and then having like new revisions of parts for the musicians every day based on the conductor's notes. Like I'm not doing that kind of stuff. So what these printing features offer are, lots of degrees of customization over how the thing that you've tweaked in Engrave Mode will appear on paper and print out. And for me, I am not doing a lot of that. So when I saw on the iPad version that they had replaced the print menu with a simple share sheet, that works actually a lot better for my needs, because it's weird, but like on the Mac version, the print menu is where you go to export the file as a PDF or as an image. And that is far more commonly the way that I'm dealing with my scores, is by sharing them digitally. So I appreciate that you just get a native, well, I won't call it the native. Is it the native share sheet? It does not look like the native share button in other apps, but it is a box with an arrow sticking out of it.
Yeah, and you can export as audio as well, which is pretty handy.
Yeah, like exporting it as an audio file, a MIDI file, an XML, or a PDF, or just simply sending the output straight to the printer without doing any tweaking. Those are like very much so the only things I ever do in print mode on the Mac.
Yeah.
So the fact that they're in this concise little share button is better for me.
Yeah, and then there is a read mode as well, and I believe this integrates with those page turning pedals, so you could use this to kind of perform your work if you wanted to.
Yeah, that's a great thing to mention, and I think that something to note with this kind of software and just software in general is like nothing can be everything. No piece of software can do the best job at every task, and I think it's important for someone like the Dorico team to say, hey, we'd like a simple way for someone to take all the visual noise of the tools off the page and just simply be able to flip through the score or one of the parts in a basic reader mode. And I think that's an essential, table stakes kind of feature to have in a notation editor. I'm glad that they did it. But for me, I'm almost always going to export the document as a PDF and put it in Musescore, because that is first and foremost where all of my music is, not just my Dorico exported projects, but it's also a place where I can have more degrees of control by annotating with the Apple Pencil, where I can add metadata, where I can organize into set lists, where I can, to be honest, just like it's where my other stuff is. So I'm always going to take that extra couple of steps to export it and read it in Musescore rather than keeping it in Dorico.
Right, yeah. So this has been a very lengthy discussion. For those that aren't in the music composition world, this is basically like everyone talks about Final Cut Pro coming to iPad one day. It's basically happened for the music notation people with Dorico and Sibelius coming to iPad. It's that kind of big of a deal, I should say.
I agree, actually. So, like I said earlier, I think that musicians are lucky that our corner of the universe has received this level of software. Sibelius and Dorico both. Like these are both offering a lot of the core desktop experiences that people are used to. And a whole lot of power. I mean, Dorico bringing especially even elements of their Engrave Mode to the iPad version and all the playback features that we talked about earlier. I mean, that's a whole lot of power in an iPad app. And for us to get it, I mean, it's on the one hand exciting, and it's also kind of sad that Apple hasn't done more in this space also, because like it makes you wonder, like, okay, if like the entirety of the layout and notation options from the desktop version of Dorico are now in an iPad app, like how is some sort of version of Final Cut not on the iPad at this point?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah. It's one day. I would imagine Apple will finally release that. We'll see.
At what point would we have hit the point where you just don't think they're going to do it anymore? Because I feel like in another 300 to 500 days, if there aren't any Apple Pro apps on the iPad, I feel like they have a farther out story about how that's going to happen.
If the Mac Pro comes out and has the M1 chip or M2 or whatever, and we're still waiting, once the Apple Silicon transition is complete, I don't know. I feel like something with the M chip will make this more simple for them to do.
But to speak to your point, I hope that other software developers in and outside of music take note of these releases, because I know that Sibelius and Dorico there's enough awareness of them, especially Sibelius, that companies like Ableton have to be looking at this and thinking to themselves, okay, like what could we do? And I know that there are various different limitations when it comes to the kinds of things you would need to do with a digital audio workstation, some of which we really hit on, like the software plugin story. There would need to be some sort of way to better manage that on iOS for one of those pro apps to really realize its true potential. But still, I wonder to myself, like, well, what about it though? Like why can't some basic version of Ableton Live run on an iPad that maybe has a more limited sample set, but that could be plugged into the Ableton Push and thrown in a bag and taken out, to a gig or something if you're a DJ? I don't know. These are the things I wonder, and I hope that other software developers see companies like Avid and Steinberg and Dorico, Sibelius being the products. I hope people see these achievements on iPad and rethink their iOS strategy.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, this has been a really fun discussion. I've been really looking forward to this because this is 10 years in the making. I've been wanting this kind of software for 10 years, and we've had, Notion, Symphony Pro 5, which are both amazing apps, but this is just another league. This is the caliber app I've been waiting for. So some closing thoughts. We have Sibelius and Dorico right now. Dorico is kind of where I found the most success for how I like to write currently, and maybe that changes when Sibelius adds MIDI keyboard support and all of that. But kind of some recommendations. Who would you recommend Sibelius for? Then Dorico, and then pricing-wise, I'd say the free version of both of these apps are great places to start, especially if you add that Steinberg account to get the 4 staffs into Dorico.
Yeah. You can get a really good feel for the features and the workflow of these apps in the free version, which is the cool thing, is that one of the most noteworthy limitations of the free versions is simply how many instruments you can have in your score. There's more than that,
yeah.
But having a lot of the experience of the application be available in the free tier, I think would give any user a real good idea of it. And, someone who wants to try Dorico, for example, might just be an amateur pianist or a guitarist, and someone who just needs to take down some ideas on a grand staff every now and then. And that this would be a perfect application for them to download and install the free version of and see if it's for them. And then maybe they move to the free version of Dorico on desktop, SE, and they share their projects across devices. And then if you're someone who needs more from it, $4 or so a month for Dorico. And then does Sibelius offer on the iOS App Store a monthly thing as an Apple in-app?
They do.
What they're doing is they already had subscription offerings for their desktop apps before this iPad release. And so where they're coming from is, I guess, for people who listen to your show who maybe are following like the iPad app ecosystem, like the Omni Group I know does this now, where they have this option for you to sort of just pay a monthly subscription for some of their apps, even the ones that have traditionally been buy it once and then keep it. So, Sibelius has for long now had their Sibelius version. It's a little confusing. So their first version of Sibelius, the free one, is called Sibelius First. The paid tier is just called Sibelius.
Yep, and on iPad, that is $6 a month in-app purchase.
So that is not so much that I wouldn't say like, hey, just try it for 1 month and see if it works for you. You could pay, so for about $10, you could for a month try both of these apps and see which one is going to fit your workflow better. I do think that I would recommend Sibelius, obviously, to anyone who is just a diehard Sibelius user or has a long-lasting history with it on desktop and doesn't want to relearn a lot of their workflows, because as much of it has been redesigned for the iPad experience, there's still some really familiar UI elements, like having that little keypad with the rhythmic durations on it is going to make anyone feel at home, like they're using,
And all your files, of course, will translate right over.
And you won't even have to, do any digging. Like if you're keeping your Sibelius files in something like Dropbox or iCloud, they're going to just all be accessible right upon the launch of the Sibelius app. So
yeah. And Sibelius Ultimate is $12.99 a month on iPad. I'm not sure what the full desktop subscription would cost if you go with that version.
Yeah, I've got to look into that more. I'm not currently a Sibelius subscriber. That's not technically true. So my school district covers the cost of Sibelius for us. The version that's authenticated through my school district is not currently on the computer that I use most often in school, which is actually a personal Mac, but that's besides the point. Yes, they are very, very slightly different in cost, but for the price of, a movie ticket or whatever, you can try both these apps and find out which one works for you. I would say Dorico is for really anyone who's just either inexperienced with this kind of software and is looking for a little bit more power from, maybe you're like someone who's used Flat.io or Musescore or Noteflight and you want a little bit more power and control, or maybe you've never used any of this software before at all. I think Dorico sits really nicely for people at all levels who are interested in, a really powerful notation editor.
Yeah. And I was looking on their website, Sibelius, as far as pricing. It's interesting. I think they might have reduced the pricing from their launch price already. On their website, they say Sibelius is $6.99 mobile app only and $10 on the web, but I'm seeing in the app here $5.99, and then Sibelius Ultimate is $20 a month if you get desktop plus mobile, and then $12.99 just on iPad. So substantial savings if you just go with the iPad version of these apps for Sibelius.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, if you're, someone who's just living the iPad life, you're going to be super happy with the fact that either one of these programs can do the extent of the things that they can.
Yeah. And as we mentioned earlier, Scoring Notes podcast has some great interviews with Sibelius people and Dorico people in your podcast, which is...
Yeah, Music Ed Tech Talk. And I've got the 2 interviews with Daniel Spreadberry that I mentioned numerous times throughout this episode, but I also am going to have some of the members of the Sibelius team on in a near future episode to talk about the iPad release. So stay tuned for that if you want more on that. And I'll also say too, this whole change in the sort of like mobile landscape of this software has kind of like got me on a kick. Like I'm currently, if you're a listener or not to my podcast, Music Ed Tech Talk, I've got quite a few guests over the next couple of months are going to also sort of be adjacent to this notation editor space. Like I'm talking with the staff pad people, and like there's just so much going on between Music, which we talked about, and all the stuff going on with the Muse group. Like my intention is to have a lot more coverage over what's going on in this space and as it relates to music educators in the near future.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for all of the time. This is the longest episode I think that this show will probably ever have. Maybe not, but yeah, this was quite the marathon session, and I appreciate your time in covering this very exciting news and what these apps can do for iPad users.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's so much fun to one of my favorite things about having any kind of my blog and my podcast are sort of like internet megaphones for my ideas, and the fact that I get to meet cool people such as yourself who are doing very exciting things with software and the same hardware that I am is awesome. And, I've met numerous people and done many, many collaborative online projects with people who I've met just over Twitter or who have emailed me, reached out to me because they read a blog post or something. And so this is one of the coolest things about putting my ideas out there is getting to connect with people like you who I otherwise would have, no connection to, and then just getting to have great conversations like this.
Yeah. And I discovered you through a retweet on Twitter. I'm not sure who retweeted it, but it's it's really exciting, Sibelius. And then you mentioned Dorico. It's didn't even hear about Dorico. Oh, that's a really awesome app as well.
This is such a reminder to me, and maybe to anyone who puts anything out there on the internet. I'm getting better at being a shameless self-promoter of myself. And the truth is as much as every time I tweet an article I wrote, or even share an article I wrote a second time, or answer someone's Facebook question in a Facebook group with a link to a podcast episode I did. Every time I do that, I feel cringy. Oh no, I'm putting myself out there. And the reality is so few people actually know what is you're creating out there as a creator, that it's that persistent putting it out there. Cause I think I know the tweet. And what's funny is I had the whole Dorico post was all in the interview and the video were all ready to go, because I was one of, I think, other than Scoring Notes, I think I was one of the only people who had all that on day one, because I knew, I was running the beta, I was kind of playing with it and just kind of thinking through, the more I got into the process of playing with it, the more I knew it would make sense to be a little bit more formal about how I put together the blog post. And so I did all that work, and then I had it available the day that Dorico launched, and it got some attention. And then the next day I was expecting the Sibelius announcement, but I didn't have access to the app. So I just wrote a quick blog post Sibelius is out. One day later, here's a link to it. It means this. And I guess because Sibelius is such a well-known brand, that short little blog post that I wrote, I think it got retweeted by Matthew Casanelli.
Oh, that's it. Yep. Casanelli's doing. Yep.
He would have to be the link between us.
Yep, absolutely. That was him.
I tweet shortcut stuff, and he follows me there. And yeah, I mean, I would bet that he recognized, even as someone who doesn't work, maybe he uses Sibelius, but I would bet that he's aware of their brand and saw that and was oh, I should put this out there. But it just speaks to the fact that it's we are doing super similar things on the internet, and are, I would say, both plugged into similar types of publications and podcasts about Apple products and software and the app ecosystem that sort of revolves around their stuff, and it's just so funny that it's like you have this composing background and like I am doing this thing. Like it's funny that we didn't connect before, and it just speaks to the fact that it's like you got to keep putting your stuff out there.
Totally.
Eventually.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. No. And it was a good. Yeah. Thank you, Matthew Castanelli. It was a really good discovery to. This has been a great chat too, and we'll have to have another one at some point in the future as more of these. Yeah, Sibelius talks about these 5 big iPad updates that are coming, and maybe in like two years when all 5 are out, and Sibelius is this transformed app into something just crazy awesome. A great foundation, but yeah, it's going to be a wild scene from here on out. Finally, let's wrap it up. Where can people find your blog and all the other awesome stuff you are up to?
Okay, so the website is robbyburns.com, and that is just sort of like an online profile for me. It's got information about teaching private lessons, just like bio, some videos, audio, pictures of me, and I've got some other stuff like publications. It's just kind of like a front for what I do. But musicedtechtalk.com is actually the URL that gets people to the blog and the podcast episodes, and it's all actually housed under the same website, so you can get there from robbyburns.com or musicedtechtalk.com. I would love it if people checked out the show. You can, of course, listen to the podcast in any podcast app. I've got a book called Digital Organization Tips for Music Teachers, which is something we didn't talk about at all today, but it's like all of this like productivity stuff, like document management, email management, note-taking, tasks, digital sheet music, managing your audio library, like all this organization-related stuff that is sort of packaged in, a way that is going to apply to the use cases of a music teacher.
Very cool. We'll have to dive into that a later point.
Yeah. It was a fun project, and I would say too, I've got a I actually think you do too. I have a Patreon for my show and for my show and for my blog now, and people who want to get more connected with me and get some fun perks can support that. I've got a Discord server, which is like the hot thing now, is create a little community around that, and it's actually pretty lively. People are always talking about this kind of stuff, like music notation software, digital audio workstations, lesson plan ideas. There's a lot of music teachers in this crowd. General like apps we recommend to each other, music recommendations, tech support that people need. It's just a fun thing to do. Plus, you get a bunch of my nerdier resources that I've created. Things like like I've made some OmniFocus project templates for the music classroom, and like some keyboard Maestro macros and just some fun stuff. So I don't know if people who are into that want to support what I do. That's my new thing I've been trying since I think June I started it.
Very cool.
Yeah, and that's I've got a YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. I'm at Robby Burns, most of those places, and Twitter is probably where I'm most active, and then YouTube is something I'm doing more with, but most of my YouTube videos are usually associated with or embedded in blog posts. So if you just want to follow me one place, probably Music Ed Tech Talk is the place to do it.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Robby, for your time. It's been just a great chat.
It's been great. Yeah.
Well, that's my discussion with Robby Burns all about Sibelius and Dorico on iPad. Check out everything that Robby's up to at robbyburns.com, including his fantastic Music Ed Tech Talk podcast. My thanks to Robby for his extensive time diving into Dorico and Sibelius, and my thanks to you for your time and attention tuning in. You can get bonus content and episodes early by supporting the podcast at patreon.com/iPadPros or by subscribing in Apple Podcasts. With that, I'll talk to everyone again real soon.